Christmas is supposed to be the most magical and joyful time of the year, but for the Anderson family, it became the most awful massacre the tiny town of Carnation, Washington, has ever seen.
911?
There's been a murder. There's 3 people dead that I can see right now.
Inside?
I just came up. She works with me.
Inside the house?
Yes.
What do you see?
There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend.
On December 26, 2007, Linda Thielu, worried when her best friend Judy Anderson didn't show up for work, went to check on her and made a horrifying discovery. Judy, her husband, their son and his wife, and even their 2 young children, just 5 and 3 years old, had all been brutally murdered. This peaceful town of barely 2,000 people had never seen anything so terrifying. What made the tragedy even stranger was that the only member of the family left alive was Michelle Anderson, Judy's daughter, who was living nearby with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe.
I'm sorry, I did because I thought I had to. And yeah, I know that's not a very good excuse, but I'm not trying to excuse myself. I'm just trying to explain my actions. I'm sorry. I'm terrible.
The Anderson family, by all accounts, didn't have any known enemies. They were loved and well respected in the community, which made the whole thing even more confusing. When news of the murders broke, people in town were genuinely shocked and heartbroken, wondering who could have done something so brutal and, more importantly, why.
Seeing everybody die, remembering what I did, how worthless as it is, how worthless I am because I killed all these people. They deserve to die. They deserve to live a lot more than I did, but they died.
To even begin to understand how all of this happened, we have to first talk about the people at the center of it all, the Anderson family. This wasn't just any family. In a small, close-knit town like Carnation, Washington, everyone kind of knows everyone. Lives are often deeply intertwined, so when something this horrifying happens, it hits differently. Based on what witnesses and neighbors have said, the Andersons seemed like your average family, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. 60-year-old Wayne Scott Anderson, the father, held a solid, well-paying job as an engineer at Boeing. His wife, 61-year-old Judy, was a familiar face in town thanks to her job at the local post office, where she became close friends with a woman named Linda. Yes, the same Linda who later made the 911 call that brought this entire case to light. Linda wasn't just close to Judy either. She seemed to be on good terms with the entire family. Wayne and Judy had 2 children, 32-year-old Scott and 29-year-old Michelle. Now, most parents wouldn't say they had a favorite child, not out loud anyway, but people who knew the family say it seemed pretty obvious that Scott was the golden child. Whether it was because Michelle struggled more or simply because Scott made safer choices, it's hard to say. But the tension was definitely there. Michelle always seemed to be the black sheep. While Scott was building a stable life, marrying a woman named Erica, having 2 young kids, Olivia and Nathan, who were just 5 and 3 years old, Michelle's life looked very different. She still lived on her parents' property, in a small trailer about 200 yards away from the main house. She didn't pay rent, worked a basic job at Target, and had a boyfriend named Joseph McEnroe, who, frankly, many considered a deadbeat. He was unemployed, directionless, and, according to some accounts, a bad influence. To make matters worse, it appeared Michelle might have been harboring deep resentment. Her brother had everything: a loving wife, 2 beautiful kids, a stable job, and the full support of their parents. Erica, Scott's wife, was also very close to Wayne and Judy. Some even believed they treated Erica more like a daughter than Michelle herself. That kind of dynamic, whether spoken or not, can eat away at someone who already feels like an outsider in their own family. On the other hand, Joseph McEnroe came from Santa Clara, California, and while he didn't grow up in Carnation like Michelle did, the two had a lot in common. His relatives described him as someone who tried hard to be liked. a quiet guy who loved video games and mostly kept to himself. He wasn't known to be aggressive or mean-spirited. In fact, people remembered him as more of a loner than anything else. But like Michelle, Joseph seemed to drift through life without a solid plan. He didn't have a stable job, no clear direction, and just seemed stuck. Still, even with all those challenges, no one expected his name to ever be connected to anything violent or tragic. Digging a little deeper, though, Joseph's life wasn't as calm as it looked. He struggled with intense anxiety and often found it hard to navigate everyday situations. One thing that really stood out about him was how easily influenced he could be. He sometimes had trouble telling right from wrong, especially in stressful moments. That kind of vulnerability made him a bit of a follower, someone who could be pulled in directions he might not have gone on his own. His relationship with Michelle started in 2001 after they met through a dating app, and it quickly became one of those intense, clingy partnerships that didn't seem all that healthy. The two leaned heavily on each other, but instead of lifting one another up, it was more like they were dragging each other down. They lived together in a trailer just a couple hundred yards from Michelle's parents' home, rent-free but far from comfortable. The place was in poor condition, and with no stable income between them, they were constantly struggling to make ends meet. Joseph didn't have many friends around, and the two of them rarely seemed to interact much with the rest of the town. Now, as mentioned earlier, Joseph McEnroe didn't have the best work ethic. He rarely made the effort to find a job, and when he did manage to get one, it usually didn't last very long. Stability was practically non-existent in his life with Michelle. Meanwhile, Michelle couldn't help but compare their situation to that of her parents, Wayne and Judy Anderson, who were both doing just fine financially. But instead of feeling supported or proud, Michelle felt overlooked, like her parents were intentionally keeping her at arm's length. She believed they weren't doing enough to help her, especially considering they'd brought her into the world. That's how she saw it anyway. Eventually, after letting her and Joseph live rent-free on their property for years, her parents decided it was time to start charging rent. And Michelle didn't take that well. She felt like they were turning their backs on her, and to make matters worse, she also claimed that her brother Scott had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from her over the years, around $40,000, she said, and had never made any real effort to pay her back. Now, despite all these hardships, Michelle and Joseph were surprisingly the ride-or-die type. They were totally committed to each other, always sticking together no matter how rough life got. They even dreamed of running off to Las Vegas to get married someday. But first, they felt like they had some unfinished business to settle with Michelle's parents, Wayne and Judy. It turned out Joseph had quietly bought 2 guns back in the summer of 2006, a Smith & Wesson Model 19 Magnum revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Those weapons were no joke. Then on Christmas Eve of 2007, instead of joining the family celebration, Michelle and Joseph showed up at Wayne and Judy's house with a deadly plan. Judy was in the back room, carefully wrapping presents for her grandkids, trying to keep the holiday spirit alive, while Wayne was somewhere else in the house, getting things ready. But behind that peaceful scene, chaos was creeping in. Joseph kept a gun hidden in his waistband to distract Judy with small talk, while Michelle moved quietly toward her dad with her own gun drawn. She aimed and tried to pull the trigger, but her gun jammed. Panic set in. Joseph quickly rushed in and fired a shot that ended Wayne's life instantly. Hearing the gunfire, Judy ran into the room, only to be met with bullets from Joseph. She fell screaming, and in a chilling moment, Joseph apologized before putting the gun to her head and pulling the trigger. With both parents now dead, Michelle and Joseph must have realized just how badly their plan had gone wrong, but there was no turning back. They knew Scott, Erica, and the kids would arrive any minute, so they scrambled to clean up the mess. They dragged the bodies to a nearby storage shed and frantically tried to wipe away the blood with towels and chemicals, hoping to erase the horror that had just unfolded in that quiet little house. Now Michelle and Joseph did manage to make the place spotless, but it wasn't going to stay that way for long. About 45 minutes after Wayne and Judy were gunned down, Scott arrived at the house with his wife Erica and their kids. The moment he stepped inside, he saw Michelle waiting for him. Things went sideways fast when she pulled out her gun and charged at him. In a desperate attempt to save his family, Scott rushed toward her, but Michelle fired 4 shots straight at him. One of those bullets pierced his neck, and just like that, his life was over. Erica was hit twice in the barrage of bullets, but somehow she held on. She knew she had to do something, anything, to stop the nightmare from getting worse. That's when she spotted a cordless phone nearby. Bleeding and barely able to move, Erica crawled over to the sofa for cover, grabbed the phone, and called for help. She managed to stay on the line only a few seconds before Joseph showed up and snatched the phone away. The operator heard only muffled voices and some yelling, and because she couldn't get clear info, she thought maybe it was just a noisy party getting out of hand. Still, she sent 2 officers to check things out.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Meanwhile, Joseph ripped the phone apart, yanking out the batteries and crushing it under his feet. Later, he admitted that Erica had been begging him the whole time, even screaming at him not to hurt the kids. All he could do was apologize again and again, but those apologies didn't stop him from finishing what he started. Joseph fired a bullet straight into Erica's head, coldly ending the 2nd generation of the Anderson family, leaving only Michelle alive. But the horror didn't stop there. There was still the youngest generation to deal with. 2 little kids, just 5 and 3 years old. You'd think after all the violence these 2 wouldn't be harmed, but that wasn't the case. Michelle looked at her niece and nephew and instantly saw them as a threat, liabilities that couldn't be allowed to live. She became terrified that if they survived, they could become witnesses in any future trial. The thought of them talking, of secrets slipping out, made her paranoid. So she decided they had to be silenced. But there was one problem. Michelle just couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. The thought of harming children was too much even for her. So she turned to Joseph, who must have been horrified at the suggestion. But deep down, even he knew the brutal truth behind her words. Together they started rationalizing the unthinkable. They told themselves that the children would be scarred for life by what they had already witnessed, that their innocence was shattered beyond repair, and maybe, in some twisted way, it was kinder to put them out of their misery quickly than to let them suffer forever. It's chilling to think about how they managed to convince themselves of such a thing. Joseph went first, taking Olivia's life with a whispered apology. The little girl's eyes didn't even have time to understand what was happening before the bullet ended her. Then there was 3-year-old Nathan, sitting on the floor, completely unaware, or maybe painfully aware, of the chaos around him. Nathan was playing quietly with the crushed batteries from the cordless phone, innocent and fragile. Joseph later said something haunting about this moment. Nathan looked up at him with full understanding, like the child somehow knew exactly what was about to happen.
If I thought that hurting myself or killing myself or doing anything, that anything I could do would go off and bring back these people or ameliorate the pain or something, I would.
And with that cold detachment, Joseph pulled the trigger once more, ending Nathan's life just like his grandparents, parents, and sister. The deed was done, but then Michelle realized something terrifying. Erica's 911 call had actually gone through. The line was brief, but it was enough for emergency services to be alerted. Panic set in as Michelle understood that the police would be arriving any minute now to investigate what had just happened. So quick as she could, she ran out to the dirt road that led up to the house and locked the front gate behind her, hoping to delay or deter any immediate entry. Just moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies showed up, responding to the 911 call. They approached the locked gate and found it shut tight. No easy way in. They listened carefully, but didn't hear any sounds of a disturbance. No yelling, no crying, nothing that would scream that something was terribly wrong. They even checked with a neighbor nearby, who said they hadn't noticed anything unusual either. Without any more leads or evidence, the deputies decided to leave the scene without digging deeper. That brief, quiet moment gave Michelle and Joseph the small window they needed. But deep down, both of them knew they had crossed the point of no return. They were the sole survivors of a brutal massacre that claimed 6 lives, a horrific act that would forever stain their lives. And despite living just a couple of hundred yards from the crime scene, the police quickly identified Michelle and Joseph as persons of interest. It wasn't a matter of if they'd be suspected, it was when. The investigators would interview them again and again, slowly unraveling the story, and eventually the truth would become impossible to hide. Whether it was out of clear-headed calculation or just desperate panic, Michelle and Joseph didn't stick around to face the music. They fled, making a run for the Canadian border in hopes of disappearing. But somewhere along the way, they realized that escaping north might not be their best bet after all. Instead, they turned west and headed to Oregon, choosing a different path in hopes of shaking the law off their trail. This meant they had to pass right by Wayne and Judy's property, the very scene of their crime. It's chilling to imagine whether they took a moment to look back, to see the aftermath of what they'd done. Back in Carnation, on December 26th, 2 days after the murder, Linda Thiele, Judy's best friend, started to worry when Judy didn't show up at the post office like she always did. It was totally out of character for Judy, who was punctual and rarely took sick days. Concerned, Linda went over to Judy's house to check on her. Peering through the window, she was met with a sight no one should ever have to see: 2 lifeless bodies lying on the floor. That moment marked the beginning of a nightmare for the whole community, as the horrifying truth of that Christmas Eve massacre slowly came to light. The first 2 bodies she saw were those of Scott and Erica, but in her shock and confusion, she initially thought they were Wayne and Judy. Her mind struggled to make sense of the horror in front of her. At that moment, Linda had no clue that every person inside that house had been shot, executed in cold blood. Instead, her first assumption, as strange as it may sound now, was that maybe it had been some kind of tragic accident. Carbon monoxide poisoning, she thought. That would at least make some sense. But once she stepped through the doorway and into the house, the truth hit her like a freight train. The signs of violence were everywhere: gunshots, blood, the unmistakable scent of death, and any illusion of an accident vanished. Completely distraught, shaking, and barely able to process what she was seeing, Linda called the police. Her voice trembled as she described what she'd just found.
There's 3 people dead that I can see right now. I just came up, she works with me. There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend.
This is locked, which makes me wonder if her daughter did it. Which is scary, because then I might be up here with the murderer.
The police swarmed in fast, setting up a perimeter around the house. Yellow tape was stretched across the property, and investigators began carefully documenting the grisly scene, while stunned neighbors looked on in shock. And right at that exact moment, almost like some twisted twist of fate, Michelle and Joseph happened to drive by. As mentioned earlier, they initially planned to flee to Canada, but changed course and were headed to Oregon. Still, something made them stop. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at their conscience, or maybe they just wanted to see what kind of chaos they'd left behind. Whatever the reason, they pulled over, stepped out of the car, and were quickly approached by police. It didn't take long before officers became suspicious. Michelle and Joseph were too close to the scene, too calm, and their timing was just too perfect. They were brought in for questioning, and from there, everything started to fall apart. At first, the couple tried to lie their way out of it. They spun a ridiculous story, saying they were heading to Las Vegas to get married, but it was flimsy, and they both knew it. The weight of what they'd done was crushing them. The pressure finally broke Michelle first. She collapsed in tears during interrogation and confessed. She sobbed through the confession, struggling to speak but wanting to get it all out. Meanwhile, Joseph stayed quiet. He insisted he was innocent, but that didn't save either of them. Both Michelle and Joseph were formally charged with 6 counts of first-degree homicide for the deaths of Wayne, Judy, Scott, Erica, and the 2 little children, Olivia and Nathan. The initial investigation proceeded rapidly, but the actual trial would not begin until almost 3 years later. This delay was due in large part to pre-trial motions, psychological evaluations, and the complexity of the evidence that had to be carefully analyzed and verified. The trial officially kicked off in the summer of 2008, when both defendants were formally arraigned and prosecutors laid out the horrific details of the case. During these early court proceedings, Michelle initially denied full involvement, but the mounting pressure, combined with the overwhelming evidence, ranging from forensic reports to phone records and chilling witness testimonies, eventually led her to a dramatic confession. It was in late 2008, several months into the trial, that Michelle broke down in tears on the witness stand and admitted she was the mastermind behind the massacre. Meanwhile, Joseph McEnroe maintained his claim that Michelle was the controlling force behind the murders, portraying himself as someone manipulated into complicity. However, prosecutors methodically dismantled this defense over the course of the trial, presenting evidence that showed Joseph was an active participant. Despite his claims, the jury was persuaded by the prosecution's argument that both Michelle and Joseph shared responsibility for the horrific acts. The community followed every twist with heavy hearts and growing impatience as the trial stretched on month after month. By early 2009, the prosecution was pushing hard for the death penalty. The 6 counts of first-degree homicide carried the possibility of the harshest punishment available under Washington state law. Prosecutors painted a picture of cold-blooded killers who had shown no remorse and had carried out a meticulously planned and savage attack on their own family members, including 2 young children. Public opinion was largely in favor of the death penalty, reflecting the anger and grief felt by many in the community. Yet, on January 31, 2013, after years of hearings, the presiding Judge Jeffrey announced a surprising decision. The death penalty was off the table for both defendants. Citing evidentiary and procedural considerations, the judge ruled that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would be the maximum sentence. While many expected capital punishment for such a brutal crime, the law required careful adherence to rules ensuring fairness and due process. The lengthy wait for a resolution had frustrated some, but it underscored the complexities of administering justice in the most serious cases. Realizing that the death penalty was no longer a looming threat, but that life imprisonment was inevitable, Joseph McEnroe changed his strategy. In the months following the judge's decision, he pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of first-degree homicide, which was a move intended to avoid any further legal battles that might have prolonged the process. In his plea, McEnroe reiterated his earlier defense that Michelle had dominated their relationship and influenced his actions, but the court was unswayed. His courtroom demeanor and the overwhelming evidence sealed his fate. Michelle Anderson, on her part, accepted full responsibility, showing deep remorse and calling herself a monster during the sentencing phase. She expressed sincere regret for the pain she caused, acknowledging the unimaginable devastation she inflicted on the family and community. Despite her pleas, the judge made it clear that the law demanded a strict sentence for such heinous crimes. Finally, in mid-2013, after nearly 8 years of legal proceedings since the murders, both Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe were formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the gravity of their crimes and the need for society's protection from such violent offenders.
Ms. Anderson, the result is pretty much preordained. Ms. Anderson, pursuant to your convictions, the law mandates that I impose 6 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of release or parole, plus a sentence of enhancement of 60 months on each count as well. I will impose the mandatory victims assessment penalty, the DNA fee. Restitution will be set at a separate proceeding, which you may waive your presence at if you so desire. I will waive all other non-mandatory fees and assessments, and that will be the order of the court.
But no matter how much justice has finally been served, the horrific memories of that terrible night still haunt everyone involved. What's truly heartbreaking is that there's no one left to mourn the Anderson family anymore, except for the very people who took their lives and a handful of close friends who managed to survive the nightmare. One of those friends, Linda, had to relive the trauma again and again throughout the entire trial, forced to revisit the worst day of her life in vivid detail while testifying, making sure the pain stayed etched into her memory forever. The small town of Carnation hasn't been the same since that awful Christmas Eve. To this day, you can bet that locals still whisper about the horrors that happened in that big house just up the road. The mobile home and the storage shed where it all unfolded still stand, silent witnesses to a nightmare that changed the community forever. It's like a shadow hanging over the place, a dark chapter that no one really wants to talk about but can't forget. So what do you think about this case? Do you believe Michelle and Joseph deserved the death penalty for what they did? Or is life without parole the right kind of punishment for such monstrous actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
Than we were after it happened. It's very disheartening.
Cavalier he was about killing people. I mean, he described the thrill he got killing people.
In this photo of what seemed like a simple but happy house, the Dardeen family's home in Ena, Illinois, became the scene of a brutal tragedy in 1987. A pregnant woman was savagely beaten to death, so violently that she went into labor during the attack. But she wasn't the only one. The entire family, including the young child in that photo, suffered the same horrific fate. This is, without a doubt, one of the most disturbing cases I've ever covered on this channel. And trust me, anyone who's looked into this case would say the same thing. Stick with us, and you'll soon see exactly why it's so haunting. To really understand the Dardeen family and the events that would follow, let's rewind to 1986. That's when 29-year-old Russell Keith Dardeen and his wife, Ruby Elaine Dardeen, moved to the tiny town of Ena, Illinois, with their 2-year-old son, Peter. By the way, they both preferred to go by their middle names, Keith and Elaine. Now, the Dardeens had settled into a beige and white mobile home on a piece of land right by Route 37. The Illinois Central Railroad tracks were just across the highway. Elaine, who was pregnant with their second child, a daughter they planned to name Casey, had a lot going on. Keith worked as a treatment plant operator, while Elaine worked at an office supply store. They were a tight-knit family, super active in their local Baptist church, and even played in the musical ensemble. Despite their modest lifestyle, the couple was deeply committed to their son Peter's future, and a significant portion of their money went into his college fund, even though he was only 2 at the time. Keith was so dedicated to his family that he even bought Kroger soda cans and resold them for 50 cents each. From this point of view, you could really tell that Keith was a family man, and all their neighbors would vouch for that. According to them, Keith and Elaine were always involved in the community, and everything seemed to be going well for the young family. It looked like life was on track for them to live happily ever after in their quiet corner of Illinois. But things in the neighborhood weren't as peaceful as they seemed. Around this time, there had been a disturbing rise in crime in Jefferson County, which had a population of about 38,577. In just the last 2 years, there had been a shocking 15 murders, including the rape and murder of a 10-year-old girl in May of 1987. And it wasn't just the recent crimes that were concerning. Ena, the town where the Dardeens lived, had its own dark history. There was a chilling case in 1924 where 2 people were murdered by their spouses through arsenic poisoning. Then in 1985, a man murdered his entire family while high on LSD. With all of this happening in and around the area, Keith couldn't ignore the rising tension. He felt uneasy about raising his family in a place that was becoming more dangerous by the day, especially with a new baby on the way. At one point, Keith told his mother that he and Elaine were planning to move back to Mount Carmel, Illinois, where he had grown up. He didn't give a specific reason, but it was clear that he was worried about the future. He even said it didn't matter whether he found a job there or not. He was determined to move back.
I said, "Why are you coming back?" He said, "There's just too many things happening down here. There's people being murdered and robbed and just all kinds of meanness." And he said, "I don't like it."
After Keith mentioned that to his mom, she thought it was a little strange, especially considering how focused the family had been on saving money. A move like that would be expensive, and it didn't really line up with the couple's usual careful planning. But Keith was determined. In fact, he even put their mobile home up for sale that same year. His desire to protect his family had only grown stronger, and it showed in his actions. One example that stood out was when he turned away a woman who came knocking on their door asking to use the phone. His protective instincts were clearly on high alert, but it left you wondering, what was making him so uneasy? Well, the answer lies on November 18, 1987, when it's been several days since Keith failed to show up for work. As we've mentioned, Keith had always been reliable and did everything he could to save and earn money. So, when he didn't show up for work that day, his boss immediately became concerned. He tried calling the house, but no one picked up. That's when he decided to reach out to Keith's parents, but they hadn't heard anything from the family either. At this point, everyone was on edge, so they decided it was time to call the police. The officers arrived at the mobile home and knocked on the door, but once again, there was no answer. One officer peered through the window and saw people lying still on the bed under the blankets, but they weren't moving. Things were starting to feel off, so the police tried to open the door. With a simple twist of the knob, they were about to uncover one of the most horrifying scenes. When the officers opened the door, they discovered the lifeless bodies of Elaine, her son Peter, and a tiny infant, all lying beneath blankets. Both Elaine and Peter were both bound and gagged with duct tape, their bodies beaten so brutally that Elaine had gone into labor and given birth to a baby girl during the attack. Even more heartbreaking is that their skulls were crushed because of the savage blows they've received. But the horror didn't stop there. The killer, or killers, showed no mercy. They went as far as to beat the newborn to death with a baseball bat. Interestingly, the bat was owned by the family, and it was a gift that Keith had given Peter earlier that year. When the police witnessed the scene, they were left in complete shock. Many officers, who had witnessed their fair share of horrific crime scenes, were visibly shaken by the brutality of what they saw. One of the most puzzling aspects was the lack of forced entry into the home, which ruled out the theory of a random robbery gone wrong. There were valuable items inside, things that could have easily been taken, but nothing was disturbed. Everything was still in its place. Even more perplexing was the fact that Elaine hadn't been sexually assaulted, which made the motive even harder to pinpoint. The killer had even attempted to clean up the blood, but it was determined that they had given up halfway through. This detail suggested the killer had time on their hands, showing no signs of urgency. They weren't worried about being interrupted or caught, so whoever did this had all the time in the world to carry out their horrific plan. But what about Keith, the father? When the police arrived, he was nowhere to be found in the trailer, and the family's car was missing too. It didn't take long for the police to start suspecting that Keith might have killed his family and fled the scene. However, when the neighbors first heard about the possibility of Keith being responsible for the murders, it didn't sit right with them.
It rattled me. I'll be the first to admit it rattled me completely, But I said there's no way I could even give any credibility to that thought whatsoever, because I knew he couldn't have done that. He just could not have ever done something like that.
A search team of law enforcement officers was quickly assigned to look for him, but just as quickly as the search had been launched, it was called off. Keith's body was discovered by a group of hunters in a wheat field not far from the family's home the following day. He had been shot 3 times in the head, a clear sign of an execution-style assassination. But the most shocking detail of all was that his genital appendage had been removed. Some accounts even suggested that the killer had stuffed it into Keith's mouth. This twisted act is a chilling indication that the killer was no ordinary criminal, but rather someone with the mind of a twisted psychopath, capable of unimaginable brutality. It's also easy to guess that the killer had some experience, or maybe they had a serious personal vendetta against the family. As the investigation unfolded, officers pieced together that Keith was most likely killed in the family car, meaning the killer or killers must have driven him there. The blood found inside the vehicle ruled out the idea that Keith was murdered in the house. It was also determined that all the victims were killed within an hour of each other. Once the news spread, the town was on edge. They'd already been dealing with rising crime, but this case took things to a whole new level of unease. The family was well liked, had no known enemies, and suddenly there were no suspects. This left everyone wondering, who could do something this brutal to a seemingly perfect family? Remember, there was no forced entry into the home, and the doors were left unlocked, so a robbery didn't seem to be the motive. Keith's gruesome sexual mutilation added more confusion, especially since there was no sign of sexual assault on Elaine. Additionally, no evidence was found to suggest any extramarital affairs, financial troubles, or any apparent grudges against the Dardeen family. While there was a trace of marijuana found in the house, there was no solid proof that they were involved in drug dealing or even used drugs, so investigators assumed it likely belonged to the killer. That's when Keith's mother, Joanne, floated a theory. Maybe someone had tried to pressure Keith into selling drugs, or maybe Elaine had turned down someone's advances, and the killer lashed out in retaliation. This idea led the police to explore different possibilities, even considering the bizarre suggestion that a satanic cult might have been behind the murders, trying to appease the devil. However, experts in cults and ritual killings quickly dismissed this theory, saying there were no signs of cult activity. With little to go on and no clear suspects, the police were left to focus on a theory. The killer must have somehow gained entry into the Dardeen home, taken Keith out, and murdered him somewhere else. Afterward, they returned to the house, tied up Peter and Elaine, and killed them both, along with Elaine's newborn baby girl. But despite this theory, the investigation seemed to hit a dead end. No one seemed to have a real lead, and the case was slipping further and further into the cold file pile. Additionally, it seemed like everyone had given up on solving this gruesome crime. But Keith's mother, Joanne, wasn't ready to let the case fade into obscurity. She wasn't going to let the brutality of what happened to her family be forgotten. She took matters into her own hands, gathering over 3,000 signatures in an effort to get the Oprah Winfrey Show to cover the case. Unfortunately, her request was denied because the producers claimed that the crime was just too brutal for daytime television. But Joanne didn't give up. Her next move was to try to get the case featured on America's Most Wanted. At first, the producers reacted the same way as Oprah's team, but after some persuasion, they agreed to do a segment on the murders. In 1998, the show aired the segment. However, despite the high-profile attention, it didn't lead to any new leads or breakthroughs. The police were no closer to solving the murders than they had been back in 1987. Then, after 12 years of nothing, the police finally got a break. They received a lead on a possible suspect named Tommy Lynn Sells. Sells was a well-known serial killer linked to over 22 murders across the United States, though he claimed to have killed over 70 people. His past was filled with trauma and darkness that seemed to follow him everywhere. Born into a tragic childhood, Tommy and his twin sister both contracted spinal meningitis when they were just 18 months old. While Tommy survived, his sister tragically passed away. Growing up, Tommy was without much guidance and didn't have anyone to turn to. His early years were marked by neglect and trauma. He began abusing substances at the young age of 7, a sign of the pain he was trying to escape. When Tommy was still a young boy, a man from a nearby town befriended him. On the surface, this man appeared to be someone who genuinely wanted to help a boy without any support. He would give Tommy gifts, take him out, and let him stay at his house. It wasn't until later that the disturbing truth came to light. The man was eventually convicted of child molestation, with Tommy being one of his victims. From the age of 8, Tommy had been abused by this man, a trauma that would go on to shape the twisted path of his life. By the age of 10, Tommy Lynn Sells had dropped out of school entirely, spending most days experimenting with smoking and drinking. At 13, after a troubling incident with his grandmother, Sells's mother, upset and alarmed, decided to leave with his siblings, leaving Tommy to fend for himself. From that point on, Sells had no family or stable home. He began drifting from town to town, finding ways to survive by doing odd jobs and taking what he needed to get by. Unfortunately, he started showing violent tendencies, with one early incident where he attacked a young woman, leaving her badly shaken. Sells later claimed that his first murder happened when he was just 16. He said he broke into a house and attacked a man who he alleged was harming a young boy, though no evidence was ever found to back up this story. Later, Sells also claimed he killed a man named John Cade Sr. in July of 1979, after Cade reportedly caught him breaking into his home. After that, Sells led a life constantly on the move, jumping from town to town, sneaking rides on trains, and stealing to get by. Then in the year 2000, Sells was arrested in Del Rio, Texas, after a horrifying attack on 2 young girls, 13-year-old Kayleen Harris and 10-year-old Crystal Searles. Sadly, Kayleen didn't survive, but Crystal lived through the ordeal and provided a description that finally led to Sells' capture. And while he was being held, Sells confessed to killing the Dardeen family too. But his account was sketchy at best, and he kept changing his story. In 2 different versions, he claimed to have met Keith Dardeen, first at a truck stop and then at a pool hall. In both stories, Sells said Keith invited him over for dinner. He said what started as a casual visit soon turned into something darker when Keith allegedly made a sexual proposition to Sells. According to Sells, Keith's offer sparked his rage, and he decided to take it out on Keith. Sells forced Keith to drive him to a secluded area where he killed and mutilated him, then returned to the trailer to kill the other witnesses, Elaine and young Peter, out of rage that he said had no stop button. In another version of events, Sells didn't mention the sexual proposition at all. Instead, he claimed he simply saw the for sale sign on the Dardeen's trailer and saw an opportunity for violence. After drinking some beers and waiting for the right moment, he knocked on the door and pretended to be interested in buying the trailer. When Keith opened the door, Sells overpowered him, bound and gagged his family with duct tape, and forced Keith to drive to a field. There, he brutally castrated Keith before shooting him. He then returned to the trailer, raped Elaine, and killed Peter and the newborn, before cleaning up the scene and driving Keith's car to Benton. As you can see, many of his statements didn't line up with official records, and despite his confession, investigators couldn't find a shred of physical evidence tying him to the Dardeen family's murder. But Sells tried to explain away these doubts by saying, "They say there's no physical evidence tying me to Dardeens, but there wasn't for any of them because they wasn't looking for me. I moved. I was always a transient." So, to see if he was actually telling the truth, the investigators of Illinois wanted to bring Sells to their state to see if he could help them find critical evidence or show that he knew specific details about the crime scene. They hoped this would prove whether he was telling the truth or just making things up. But there was a catch. Texas law prohibits death row inmates from being moved to another state. Illinois officials tried to get an exception, hoping to bring Sells in for further questioning, but their request was denied. Without any concrete evidence linking Sells to the Dardeen murders, Illinois authorities ultimately decided not to pursue charges. Now the doubts surrounding Sells' confession didn't only come from law enforcement. Friends and family of Keith Dardeen, the man Sells claimed to have met before the murders, also raised concerns about his story. They found it hard to believe that Keith, fully aware of the dangerous situation in the area due to years of violent killings, would invite a stranger into his home for dinner. A friend of Keith's remarked, if he wouldn't let a young girl in to use the phone, he wouldn't let a 22-year-old man in. Sells' claim that Keith made a homosexual advance toward him also seemed suspicious. This didn't line up with what anyone knew about Keith's character. He had never shown any interest in men, and the police investigation didn't find any evidence to support Sells' claim. Detectives who spoke with Sells suspected that he fabricated this detail to make the crime seem more justified in his mind. Sells often used similar tactics when confessing to other murders, claiming that the victims had provoked him in some way, making it easier for him to justify his actions. As investigators dug deeper into Sells' confessions, it became increasingly clear that his story wasn't adding up. His details were often inconsistent, and as time passed, it became harder to believe he was truly responsible for the Dardeen murders. It seemed like Sells was trying to take credit for these killings, along with many others, just to manipulate the legal system and make himself seem more dangerous or important. In the end, even though Sells confessed to more than 70 murders and was linked to over 22, he was only convicted of one, the murder of Kayleen Harris. On April 4, 2014, he was executed by lethal injection for that crime, with no conviction tied to the Dardeen murders. So, despite everything, the Dardeen family murders remain officially unsolved. The lack of solid evidence linking Sells to the crime leaves plenty of room for doubt, and many questions about what really happened that night are still up in the air. One of the biggest mysteries is the brutal nature of the murders. The violence used on the Dardeen family, especially Elaine and her children, seemed excessively cruel, even for someone like Sells. Some investigators have wondered if the killer might have had a personal connection to the family, but no evidence has ever surfaced to back that up. Another question that remains unanswered is the timeline of the murders. Did Keith come home to find the killer already there, or was he taken hostage during the attack? The fact that there was no forced entry suggests that the family might have known their killer, but without any solid leads, this is still just a theory. If you want us to dive deeper into Tommy Lynn Sells' case, definitely let us know in the comments. But in the meantime, we want to hear what you think about the Dardeen murders. Do you believe Sells was really the one who killed the family, or do you agree with what law enforcement and Keith's family have said, that he might not have been the killer after all? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We're curious to know where you stand on this one.
On May 10, 2025, 4 members of the same family were found dead in Nebraska. a case police are calling one of the most tragic the state has seen in years.
New developments in a tragic case in Kalispell where police are investigating the deaths of 4 family members. Officials are calling it a murder-suicide.
What makes this story even sadder is that the family was actually supposed to be celebrating a graduation that very day. One of the family members had just finished school, and instead of cheers and joy, the day ended in tragedy. But as investigators dug deeper into what really happened, they uncovered something more painful than anyone could have expected. Cries for help, signs of deep mental health struggles, and a lot of things that had been building up over time. And just a heads up, since YouTube is super strict about certain words like the big S word, we'll be using a different term for it throughout this video because, trust me, it comes up a lot in this case. So what really happened? Why did a day that should have been full of pride and love turn into one of Nebraska's darkest days? Let's dig into it now.
It was something that I never could have imagined would have been the outcome for their story, not even in a million years.
Now, before we get into the headlines and what actually happened, let's first talk about the family at the heart of this heartbreaking story, the Koch family. Jeremy Koch, a 42-year-old father, and his wife Bailey, who was 40, lived with their 2 sons, Hudson and Asher, in the peaceful, close-knit town of Johnson Lake, Nebraska. On the outside, they looked like the perfect family. You know, the kind you'd see in holiday cards. Smiling faces, cozy home, friendly neighbors, the whole picture-perfect vibe. Jeremy ran a small landscaping business in town. He was known as a hard-working guy, someone who took care of his family with grit and dedication. Bailey, on the other hand, was one of those teachers every student remembered. She worked at the local high school and was deeply loved by the community. Her students adored her, her co-workers respected her, and she was seen as someone with a big heart and a lot of kindness to give. Their 2 boys, Hudson and Asher, were the light of their lives. Hudson, the older brother, was everything parents could hope for: smart, polite, involved in school activities, and doing all the right things. His graduation day was right around the corner, and the family had every reason to celebrate. Asher, the younger brother, looked up to Hudson so much. He admired everything about him and followed his lead. In fact, the 2 brothers had a close bond, often seen together at family events, laughing, goofing around, and having each other's backs. From the outside looking in, the Koch family seemed like they had it all. Loving parents, bright kids, and a life built on strong values and deep connection. But like so many families who quietly carry their struggles, the reality behind closed doors was much heavier. Jeremy, despite showing up for his family and doing his best, had been battling something deep and dark for a long time. His fight with mental illness wasn't new. It had been haunting him since 2009 when he was first diagnosed with severe depression and psychosis. These weren't just passing moods or bad days. These were serious mental health challenges that had taken a toll on him for over a decade. And over the years, Jeremy tried different treatments, including something called electroconvulsive therapy, which is often used in really severe cases. Now, don't think for a second that Jeremy was alone or didn't have strong support around him. His best friend, his wife, Bailey Koch, had been right there by his side for almost 30 years. These 2 had been through so much together, dealing with the roller coaster ride of Jeremy's mental health struggles. Bailey was always the optimist, the steady rock who never stopped believing Jeremy could find some peace and get better. In fact, when we checked out Bailey's Facebook page, it was clear just how much she stood by him. Her posts were full of encouragement, hope, and endless support for her husband. You could really see how determined and positive she was, always trying to hold on to that light even when things got really tough. And it didn't even stop at just posting on her Facebook page. Bailey went the extra mile and set up a GoFundMe page called Jeremy's Battle Mental Health Support Needed. On that page, she poured out the real story of her husband's long fight with depression. She described their family as vanilla as it gets, just a normal life with 2 teenage sons, one of whom was about to graduate high school and was planning to move to California for a 3-year bonsai apprenticeship. But then, in bold and honest words, she wrote, "But my husband tries himself a lot." As mentioned earlier, Jeremy was first diagnosed with severe depression back in 2009. Over the years, he survived at least 4 serious attempts to end his life. The worst one was so intense it involved him driving a semi-truck dangerously on the highway trying to take his own life. Bailey described what happened after that terrifying event. Jeremy ended up with a leg broken in 4 places, a punctured lung, a fractured pancreas, a complete colon reconstruction, and a brain bleed. Yet, despite all that physical damage, the depression still stayed with him. When he finally woke up from that ordeal, Bailey said she was both amazed and relieved, because in a way, his failed attempt meant he had a chance to keep fighting. For about 7 years after that, Jeremy managed to stay clear of those darkest thoughts, but then, in July of the 2024, his mental health took a sharp downturn. He wasn't able to work anymore, which meant their landscaping business began to struggle, and the family had to rely mostly on Bailey's teaching salary to get by. Then, just a couple of months ago in March, Bailey shared a chilling moment. She woke up to Jeremy shaking her awake and saying, "Something is wrong." She found him standing over their bed with a knife, ready to end his life. Thankfully, she was able to calm him down and convince him to accept help. Jeremy spent several days in the mental health wing of a hospital. They tried some treatments, including electroconvulsive therapy, but those didn't seem to make much difference. He even got declined for ketamine treatments, which left the family frustrated and desperate. Back at home, things got worse. Jeremy wouldn't get out of bed or eat, and Bailey said he ended up back in the hospital because he was severely dehydrated. She wrote, "By not eating or drinking, Jeremy is slowly completing to EDN his life." It was a heartbreaking cry for help. Bailey revealed she had spent every penny they had just to pay the bills, drained both her retirement savings and Jeremy's, and had even started thinking about selling their family business because the stress was crushing her husband. She said plainly, "Nothing is worth losing him." Just 2 days before everything tragically ended, on May 8, 2025, Bailey posted an update. She said Jeremy was home but wasn't reacting well to his new medications. Still, she held on to hope, because a hospital about an hour from their home was offering a different kind of treatment. They were planning to go there on May 10th, 2025 to see if Jeremy would qualify. The GoFundMe had raised more than $20,000 by that point, but oddly, it was taken down on the afternoon of May 12th, 2025. No one knows exactly why. Now, here's what we do know. On the morning of May 10th, 2025, the day started off like any other big celebration. Hudson, their eldest son, was turning 18 and getting ready for his high school graduation. Bailey was full of pride and excitement, spending the morning helping him get ready, making sure every little detail was perfect. She snapped photos of Hudson in his cap and gown, cherishing these last moments before he stepped into adulthood. Their house was buzzing with that special graduation morning energy. You know, the kind filled with nervous excitement and hopeful smiles. Even Jeremy, despite everything he'd been going through lately, seemed to share in the pride. He clapped Hudson on the back and offered some quiet congratulations. Nothing seemed out of place. The tension that had been hanging over their home for months seemed to lift a bit amidst the celebration. Bailey, who had long been a beloved teacher in their community, was just as excited for the ceremony as Hudson was. Asher, their younger son, who was 16, couldn't wait to see his older brother take this big step in life. Everything felt right. like a normal family celebrating a major milestone. But no one could have imagined how quickly that joy would turn to tragedy. By early afternoon, things began to shift. It started as a small change, a subtle difference in Jeremy's behavior. He grew distant, more withdrawn than usual. Hudson was upstairs finishing preparations for the ceremony, and Asher was in another part of the house. Bailey noticed Jeremy standing in the living room, staring off into space like he wasn't really there. She called his name, but he didn't respond. Now, it wasn't unusual for Jeremy to retreat into himself sometimes, especially with his mental health struggles, but this time something felt different. Bailey's worry grew when Jeremy suddenly moved toward her. His eyes were cold and vacant, like someone else had taken control of his body. Without warning, he attacked her. Hudson, hearing the commotion, rushed downstairs to find his mother struggling beneath his father's grip. He froze in shock, unable to process what was happening. Before he could even react, Jeremy, in a terrifying flash of rage, turned the knife on Hudson. The attack was swift, brutal, and completely unexpected. The man who had once been a loving father was now possessed by something much darker. Hudson fought for his life, trying desperately to escape the assault. Asher, who had just come downstairs, witnessed the nightmare unfold. The sight of his family being torn apart left him frozen, paralyzed by fear, unable to understand what was happening. The violence escalated. The small house became a battleground. Jeremy, consumed by rage, didn't stop. He moved between his wife and sons, attacking each of them with shocking ferocity. Hudson struggled but eventually collapsed to the floor in his final moments, his screams echoing through the house. But there was no one left to hear. Terrified and in shock, Asher tried to run, but Jeremy was already on him. In a final, brutal act, Jeremy turned the knife on his youngest son, ending his life before Asher's desperate cries could even fill the walls. When the violence finally stopped, all 4 family members were dead. The house, once a place of cherished memories, had become a crime scene, its walls stained with the remnants of this horrific act.
It was a Saturday morning discovery that shook the community. The Koch family, 41-year-old Jeremy, his wife Bailey, and their 2 teenage sons found dead in their home the day of their oldest son's high school graduation in an apparent murder-suicide carried out by Jeremy.
Now, if you're wondering how the police responders even found out about this nightmare, it all started with a neighbor who heard strange noises coming from the Koch house and called the Dawson County Sheriff's Office. When deputies arrived, they walked into a scene nobody could prepare for. Jeremy, Bailey, and their 2 sons, Hudson and Asher, were all dead, victims of a brutal attack that seemed to come out of nowhere. The murder weapon, a knife, was still at the scene, and it quickly became clear Jeremy was the one who carried out this horrific act, turning on the people he once loved. This is exactly why sharing their story matters so much. While a lot of places now recognize mental health as a real serious illness, there are still many parts of the world where it's dismissed or misunderstood, seen as something fake or just brushed off. That's why people like Jeremy couldn't find the light or help for what was happening inside their minds. And sadly, that kind of silence can lead to tragedy. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think should have happened to prevent this? How could things have been different to stop this from ever taking place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It was a morning of utter horror when an entire family was found strangled to death in the quiet stillness of their own home. As the police began to investigate the warning signs that had been ignored for far too long, every clue seemed to trace back to one person, someone so intimately close to the victims he could have slit a throat without taking a single step forward. Who were these people? You may be wondering. Police in Columbia, Illinois walked into this house of horrors on the morning of May 5th, 2009. 31-year-old Sherry Coleman was found lifeless in her bed, a rosary wrapped tightly in her hand. In the rooms nearby, her 2 young sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were also discovered brutally strangled, their bedsheets undisturbed, as if death had crept in while they slept. But who informed the police about this tragedy? It was around 7 in the morning when Detective Justin Barlow received a call that would mark the beginning of a haunting investigation. Chris Coleman was at the gym, said he couldn't get a hold of his wife, Sherry. Concerned, Barlow made his way to the Coleman residence for a welfare check. What he found inside would haunt him forever. Sherry bore 3 distinct ligature marks across her neck and a black eye, evidence that she had fought desperately for her life. Her boys, however, had no such signs. Their deaths were swift, too swift. The walls were vandalized with spray-painted messages. One read, "Punished." Another read, "You knew this was coming." One of the boys had even been defaced with paint. "This was a monster," said KTVI reporter Chris Hayes. "Somebody who would spray-paint the walls, spray-paint one of the boys, strangle the kids while they slept. It was a monster." It was a picture-perfect family, the kind you'd expect to see, smiling in a church bulletin or framed on a mantel. Violent crime wasn't supposed to touch places like Columbia, Illinois. That kind of darkness belonged across the river, in the city streets of St. Louis, not in this quiet suburban town. That's exactly why Christopher Coleman chose to raise his family there. It felt safe, peaceful, godly. Faith had always been the foundation of Chris's life. His parents, Connie and Ron, were co-pastors at Grace Church in nearby Chester, Illinois. Chris himself had a disciplined background. He served in the Marines as a K-9 handler, and it was during a training seminar that he met Sherry Weiss, a fellow military police officer in the U.S. Air Force. Their love was swift and intense. A trip to Chicago turned into a wedding, and soon after, they were expecting their first child, Garrett. Gavin followed not long after. A tight-knit, loving family was forming. Chris had climbed high, securing a 6-figure position as the head of security for internationally renowned televangelist Joyce Meyer. It wasn't long when Chris became Meyer's personal bodyguard. Meyer had known Chris since he was a child. She trusted him. The Colemans were admired, protected, even blessed, at least on the surface. But in this world where religion and righteousness were so deeply rooted in lives, danger sometimes hides behind the mask of devotion, and whispers of resentment were already beginning to rise from the shadows. And then, one day, everything took a turn. In November 2008, the calm began to crack. A blackmail via email filled with obscenities and threats was sent not just to Chris Coleman, but to Joyce Meyer and her son as well. The message was clear: stop preaching or face deadly consequences. By January 2009, the threats had escalated. Chris approached his neighbor across the street, Detective Sergeant Justin Barlow, with something far more personal. A letter had been left inside his mailbox. It demanded the same thing as the email: tell Joyce to stop preaching or Chris's family will die. I will kill them all as they sleep. Sherry was shaken, especially because the note had been delivered while Chris was away in Hawaii with Joyce Meyer. When he returned, he filed a formal police report. Barlow, alarmed, installed a security camera focused squarely on the Coleman mailbox. Officers increased patrols in the neighborhood, but despite every effort, the camera picked up nothing suspicious. No shadowy figure, no anonymous threat. The only footage it captured was heartbreakingly normal. Chris playing catch with his sons, Garrett and Gavin, in the front yard. 12 hours later, that same home would become a crime scene. The boys, along with their mother, would be found dead. And the threats that seemed to shake the Coleman house became so real, it left 3 of its members dead. Chris's mother, Connie, later recalled how the threats deeply frightened Sherry, especially one letter that appeared while Chris was away on a trip to Hawaii with Joyce Meyer. Sherry had begun to fear that whoever was behind the threats was getting closer. Too close. On the morning of May 5th, Chris left his home on Robert Drive to go work out at a gym in South St. Louis County. While at the gym, he called Sherry's phone and left a message. He texted her, tried calling again, and when she didn't respond, he reached out to the police. Chris told Barlow he couldn't reach his wife and asked for a welfare check. Barlow met another Columbia officer outside the Coleman home. There, they noticed a basement window had been opened. The two men entered cautiously, descending into the dark basement and making their way through the house. What they found was beyond disturbing. Spray-painted messages in large red letters defaced the walls. "I am always watching. You have paid." And in the bedrooms upstairs, the family that once seemed so safe, so protected, was gone. "Oh, but did we tell you?" Weeks before the murders, Sherry texted a friend, "If something happens to me, Chris did it." And she wasn't guessing. She said he wanted a divorce, that she and the kids were in the way of his job. Turns out she saw it coming all along, but that wouldn't save her. What really sparked curiosity was when police began wondering, why was a bodyguard receiving threats on behalf of a famous preacher? And when this question filled the minds of the investigators, all heads turned to Chris Coleman. Moving forward, Chris would be under scrutiny for even the tiniest moves he would make, leading to the revelation of the biggest betrayal in this dream family. But marriage troubles alone wouldn't hold up a murder charge. This is when the investigators came to know about Tara. While Chris Coleman was standing at the gravesite burying his wife Sherry and their two young sons, he was secretly texting Tara, a cocktail waitress from a poker room in St. Petersburg, Florida. And Tara wasn't just anyone. She was Sherry's best friend from high school. Detectives seized Chris's computer and uncovered a digital treasure trove of evidence that revealed the full extent of the affair. There were explicit photos and videos, too provocative to share, exchanged between Chris and Tara, revealing a steamy hidden relationship. Beyond the intimate texts, Chris had saved personal details about Tara, her measurements, her ring size, and even the name they had planned for a baby girl, Zoe. Chris was officially supposed to be guarding the world-famous televangelist Joyce Meyer while on a trip to Hawaii. Instead, he was caught on camera with Tara in a hotel room, betraying not just his wife and family, but his entire world. When confronted, Chris's father, Pastor Ron Coleman, offered an explanation. Tara was just meeting a need that Sherry at the time wasn't taking care of, he said. Every man has desires, and if a wife doesn't respect you, you're going to find respect someplace else. When pressed if Sherry was a bad wife, Ron responded that just at that short, brief time, she had stepped back from doing her job as a wife. But the police weren't buying his excuses. As they dug deeper, they uncovered something way more disturbing. Those emails that had terrified Chris's family were sent from his own computer. The same man crying at his family's funeral was living a double life, and it wasn't looking good. Then came more clues. Along the route Chris usually took to the gym, right near the Jefferson Barracks Bridge, investigators found evidence, and when they checked his phone data, something didn't add up. On the morning of May 5th, instead of going straight home like he normally would, Chris took a weird, roundabout route. It all pointed to one thing. Chris wasn't just a grieving husband and dad. Police were starting to believe he was the one behind the murders. Just a few days later, Major Jeff Connor, who led the investigation, came out and said it. He believed they knew who the killer was. A critical moment came after a conference call with renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden. Baden concluded Sherry and her children were almost certainly killed before Chris left the house that morning. This timeline was crucial. It meant Chris was likely home when the murders happened. Chris said that when Sherry didn't answer his calls, He asked his neighbor, off-duty police sergeant Justin Barlow, to check on the family. Surveillance footage shows Barlow entering the Coleman house at 6:51 a.m., where he found the bodies and the chilling spray-painted messages on the walls. Chris returned home 5 minutes later, pulling into the driveway at 6:56 a.m., just seconds before the first officers arrived. But what shocked police even more was Chris's reaction when they told him his wife and children were dead. He didn't ask how they died. He didn't try to see the bodies. The evidence indicates Chris did not make any attempt to go up those stairs. KTVI reporter Chris Hayes said, "Officers thought they'd have to restrain him from seeing his dead family, but he didn't try. He didn't ask, how were they killed? He just sat on the front lawn with his head in his hands." Chris's father, Ron Coleman, recalled the awful morning. By the time he got there, Chris was sitting outside on the driveway, and then they took him into an ambulance. Ron went in and sat with him. It was a horrible morning, as Ron said, but there were other strange signs. Someone noticed scratches on Chris's arm. He looked at them and started punching the gurney inside the ambulance. Despite these suspicious behaviors and mounting evidence, Ron Coleman remained convinced his son was innocent.
Is there any way that there's a part of Chris that you don't know that could have been capable of this?
Not in my view. You couldn't put something around your kid's throat unless you're a monster.
There's no way his son did this, he insisted, but the police were growing increasingly sure that Chris Coleman's role in the murders was far darker than anyone wanted to believe. Just hours after the grim discovery of Sherry Coleman and her two sons, police brought Chris Coleman into the interrogation room.
Well, I set my alarm clock for 5:30, and I used my phone for my alarm clock. And got up at 5:30, went in the bathroom, put these clothes here I got on, and went to the bathroom, basically got in the truck and left. And drove off. I got to, I don't know where I was at, but called Sherry to wake her up, get her going, and she didn't answer, of course. And so I went on to the gym, to Gold's Gym, over by Ronnie's Plaza in South County, and started working out. I text her at some point. I might even have called her again. I don't remember. I could probably look at my phone if you want me to.
Do you guys have a home phone number too, or just cell phones?
No, we just use cell phones. So I text her, and then she still didn't respond, and probably now it had to have been well after 6 o'clock sometime when I texted her or called her. I'm sure it's still on her phone what time it was. Okay. And she didn't respond. That's not like her, because the kids should have been up and stuff, or getting up and going by then, I believe. And so I called her again. On the way back, or when I was getting ready to leave, and she didn't respond again.
Detectives started by asking about the night before. Did they have an argument? Chris insisted everything was fine, even said Sherry slept on his arms at the couch that evening. He seemed certain nothing was wrong. But the officers pushed deeper. They pointed out that neighbors had reported hearing a fight and asked why anyone would say that if it wasn't true. Chris denied any argument, insisting he was being honest. When questioned about whether he'd gone to bed at the same time as Sherry, he said yes, describing the usual bedtime routine, brushing his teeth, locking the doors. Everything was normal.
Come on, Chris, help me out with this.
I'm telling you, I've already told you. I told everybody. I told the guy in the ambulance. I told you. I told him.
The more we go back like this, the more it makes me think that there maybe isn't a good explanation for it. I mean, we need to know what happened. We can't keep going on this. It didn't, she was alive when I left. We know that's not true, and there's nothing we can do about changing that. If we know she wasn't alive when you left this morning, there's got to be an explanation. Now is the time to tell us. Now is the time to get this out in the open.
I don't know what else to tell you.
Yes, you do. Yes,
no.
You do. You have to tell me the truth, Chris.
I'm telling you the truth.
Then, while the detectives were out of the room, Chris received a text from his father asking if he needed a lawyer. This moment hinted at the rising tension. Back in the room, detectives probed about anyone else in Chris's life. Any romantic involvement. Chris mentioned a woman named Tara from Florida, calling her just a friend and someone to talk to, downplaying what was really an affair. They asked about Sherry that morning. Did she seem okay when he left for the gym? Chris said yes, but little did he know. The evidence, including forensic experts' analysis, showed Sherry and the kids were already dead by then.
And you know what, for right now, I'm just going to have a seat there. I'm not sure what I want to do, but... here's another water if you need it, okay? Police department. I mean, obviously, we got an investigation to do, so I got to go over your Miranda rights, just because we're talking to you, we're talking to a lot of people, okay?
I've done it for myself.
I'll tell you what, from the beginning, let's just start up from when you got up this morning until the time you pull up at the house. Just kind of.
Detectives challenged him directly, telling Chris that the physical evidence said otherwise. He insisted Sherry was alive, that the kids were alive. The tension grew. When asked if he was involved in the deaths, Chris flatly denied it. When asked about anyone else being involved, he said he didn't know. When pressed if he had talked to anyone about arranging her death, he denied it vehemently. The questioning circled back to Tara.
How long have you been in a relationship with Chris?
Since late November, early December.
Where all of you guys been together?
Phoenix and Hawaii, Maui.
What would he tell his wife when he was gone?
He would have just told that he was working.
Was there an affair? Chris initially denied it, then admitted to some conversations that might not have been okay in Sherry's eyes. The detectives were now piecing together a picture of a man caught between a crumbling marriage and a secret relationship, one with deep complications. And then came a bombshell. The detectives told Chris that Tara was already talking to police in Florida and had shared the very explicit photos and messages Chris had sent her. The interrogation room quieted as the officers made it clear the story of a stranger sneaking in to kill Sherry and the boys just didn't add up. Detectives even pointed out how Chris's writing style matched threatening emails sent to Sherry. They found evidence that the paint used in the threatening messages on the walls was bought by Chris months earlier, something he explained away as innocent, saying he and his son bought it for paint gun targets. Chris's father insisted none of this meant his son was guilty. He believed the promise ring Tara bought was just a fling Chris was trying to escape. But the deeper the police dug, the more the evidence and witnesses, especially Tara's detailed accounts, showed how deeply concerning this whole situation became. In Florida, police described Tara as visibly upset, someone who knew details of the affair and had become possessive. She told officers that Chris was careful to cover his tracks, even sending photos to prove he wasn't cheating in some moments. Yet the affair was real, the promises of marriage and children discussed, things Chris's father said his son tried to back away from but couldn't. While Tara voluntarily cooperated, providing police with texts and messages, Chris remained silent on guilt. Police then went for a tough approach, confronting him with the reality of what lay ahead if he didn't confess: a loss of peace in this life and the next. It wasn't long before Chris Coleman was arrested at his parents' home on May 19, 2009. Charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, police revealed he had tried to cover his tracks by spray painting messages on the walls to make it look like someone else committed the murders. After delays and attempts to move the trial, the case finally went to court in April 2011. Jurors were carefully selected from outside the local area, ensuring a fair trial free from local bias. The interrogation laid bare a tangled web of lies, secrets, and betrayal, setting the stage for a shocking trial where the truth about Chris Coleman would finally be revealed. After 2 long days and 15 hours of going back and forth, The jury finally made their decision on May 5th, 2011, exactly 2 years after Sherry and her 2 sons were murdered. The timing couldn't have been more symbolic. Chris Coleman was found guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder, but it wasn't easy. One of the jurors, Kim Ferrari, later said that 4 people on the jury weren't fully convinced at first. They needed more, something solid that would erase any lingering doubt. And oddly enough, they found it by accident. Tucked away in the jury room from the start were some foam boards with photographs on the back. Those photos showed Chris and his mistress, Tara Lintz, looking cozy together, and they were clearly dated October 2008. Why did that matter? Because Chris had been insisting all along that he didn't start the affair until November of the same year, after the threatening emails to his wife had already begun. But these photos said otherwise. The affair started earlier than he claimed, which made his whole timeline fall apart. And to the jury, that lie was the final nail in the coffin. As soon as they saw those pictures, the mood in the jury room shifted. Juror Kim Ferrari recalled that everyone was finally on the same page. Ferrari said she would have voted for the death penalty without hesitation, and she believed the rest of the jury would have too. But Chris never gave them the chance. Right after the conviction, he suddenly waived his right to be sentenced by the jury and left his punishment in the hands of the judge, Milton Wharton. It was a surprising move, but Ferrari believed she knew why he did it. He knew they were going to send him to death row. Even if Chris couldn't go to hell yet, Judge Wharton sent him to prison for life without the possibility of parole. No way out, no second chances. Ferrari wasn't disappointed by the life sentence. In fact, she saw it as justice in its own form. He's going to have to sit in prison and think about what he did every day for the rest of his life, she said. And in truth, a death sentence wouldn't have changed much. Just 2 months before the trial began, Illinois officially abolished the death penalty. Chris Coleman was sent to Pontiac Correctional Center in Illinois, a high-security prison between Bloomington and Chicago. Later that summer, in August 2011, he was moved to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. The reason was, ironically, safety concerns. He also made an effort to get a new trial, but the judge denied that request too. Chris Coleman will never walk free again, and now he has nothing but time to sit, to think, and to live with the weight of what he did. In December 2012, something heartbreaking happened all over again. The bodies of Sherry Coleman and her 2 young sons, Gavin and Garrett, were exhumed from Evergreen Cemetery in Chester, Illinois. They were then reburied near Sherry's hometown, just outside of Chicago. It was a deeply emotional and controversial decision. Chris Coleman's family fought hard to keep the graves in Chester. In fact, they went to court over it. Chris's parents, Ron and Connie Coleman, still lived in the area and felt they had every right to be close to their grandkids' final resting place. After all, they were family too. But the court saw it differently. A judge ruled that a convicted murderer should not have any say in where his victims are laid to rest, especially when his own planned gravesite had been right next to theirs. It didn't sit right. The judge ultimately decided it was more appropriate for Sherry and her sons to be buried in a place chosen by her family, not the family of the man found guilty of killing them. Even after the bodies were moved, the original headstone at Evergreen Cemetery remained in place. It had been paid for by Chris's parents, and for a time it stood as a heavy, emotional reminder of the lives lost and the complex grief left behind. Chris Coleman didn't stop fighting after his conviction. He and his lawyers filed multiple appeals, but in January 2015, a judge rejected their efforts and upheld both the conviction and his life sentence. But that didn't stop Chris from talking. In a phone interview with Crime Watch Daily in April 2018, Chris insisted he was innocent. He even claimed there was a key detail the jury never heard. According to Chris, he had 2 laptops at the time, one that he traveled with and another that stayed either at home or the office. The threats to his wife, he claimed, were linked to the one he didn't carry with him. He seemed to be suggesting that someone else could have sent the emails using the device he left behind. That same month, his father, Pastor Ron Coleman, also defended him on the show. He refused to believe his son could be guilty and said an affair simply wasn't enough reason for murder. Then, in a new legal twist, Coleman's attorneys filed yet another request for a new trial. This time, they argued that those extra photographs, the ones the jurors discovered during deliberation, should not have been considered. They claimed the evidence was improper and that it unfairly influenced the verdict. Surprisingly, a judge agreed to take a closer look and granted an evidentiary hearing in March 2019. But after reviewing everything, that same judge denied the appeal in July 2020. So once again, Chris Coleman remained right where he'd been, behind bars, serving a life sentence without parole, still claiming he was framed, still insisting on his innocence. But with the courts shutting him down at every turn, his story wasn't changing any outcomes. And the real question is never if he did it, but why did someone like him ever think he could get away with it?
I'm sorry, the Cowden family did not get justice. And I was a part of their not getting justice.
These were the words of an officer who once investigated a family massacre so brutal, so disturbing, and so heartbreaking that even now justice remains just out of reach. We're talking about the Cowden family disappearance, which quickly turned into one of the most horrific massacres Oregon has ever seen. What happened to this family was so random and shocking that by the end of this video, you'll wish they had never been found, because the terrifying truth about their deaths is even more tragic than anyone could imagine. For starters, let's get to know who the Cowden family were. Richard Cowden, 28 years old, was a hard-working man who dedicated his days driving logging trucks through the dense forests of Oregon. His wife, Belinda, just 22, was a loving mother to their 2 young children, 5-year-old David and their baby girl, Melissa, who was only 5 months old at the time. The Cowdens lived in White City, a small town in southern Oregon, and like many families, they often sought out the beauty and peace of the nearby wilderness to get away from everyday life. So, in 1974, they decided to make a spontaneous trip to Carberry Creek near Copper, Oregon, for the Labor Day weekend. As you can imagine, this wasn't a case of a family venturing into the woods for the first time, blindly setting up camp in the middle of nowhere. No, the Cowden family were locals. They knew these woods like the back of their hands. Richard, Belinda, and their kids had spent plenty of time in the forests and towns around Copper, Oregon. They knew the land well and had always felt safe there. Now, the trip itself was actually a bit last minute. Richard had originally planned to work on the driveway that weekend, but when those plans fell through, the family decided to take a break from the routine and head into the great outdoors. They packed up their car, with their trusty basset hound Droopy in tow, and made their way to the campsite near Carberry Creek. Carberry Creek was located in a quiet, remote area not far from Copper, Oregon. But it's important to note that Copper wasn't much of a town at all. It was small, consisting of only a handful of houses and a general store. In fact, the town would cease to exist just a few years later, in 1980, when a dam was constructed on the Applegate River, flooding the area. Their plan for the weekend was straightforward. They would drive out to Carberry Creek on Friday, camp for 2 nights, and then on Sunday stop by Belinda's mother's house in Copper for a visit. Afterward, they planned to head back home to White City. The weather was perfect, sunny and clear with not a cloud in the sky. Everything seemed set for a relaxing and enjoyable time away. But as with many stories like this, things didn't go according to plan. The details of what transpired during the camping trip are unclear. No one knows exactly what the family was up to while at the campsite, though it's generally believed they were enjoying their time there. On Sunday morning, the day they were supposed to head home, Richard and young David were last seen at around 9 a.m. at the general store in Copper, which was only about a mile down the road from their campsite. They had stopped by to pick up some milk and a few other supplies, as most families do while camping. But after that, they vanished without a trace, and no one would see them again. According to sources, it was Belinda's mother who first realized that something was wrong. As mentioned earlier, Richard and Belinda had planned that they would stop by her mother's house for dinner before heading back home. So when dinner time came and they didn't show up, Belinda's mother grew concerned. She had prepared the meal, expecting them, but as time passed and there was still no sign of the family, she decided to drive to the Carberry Creek campsite to check on them. Remember, Richard and David had gone to the general store that morning to buy some milk, which meant that Belinda and the baby were back at the campsite. Could something have happened while the two men were away? When Belinda's mother arrived at the campsite, she found the family's pickup truck still parked by the side of the road, just where they had left it earlier. But as she walked into the campsite itself, her sense of unease grew. Everything seemed to be in place, as if the family had only just left. The camp stove was set up, and their belongings, including the family's truck keys and Belinda's purse, were all right there in plain sight. Even a half-full carton of milk bought earlier that morning was sitting on the picnic table. Even more chilling was the discovery of Richard's wallet, which contained $21, roughly the equivalent of $135 in 2024. Alongside it was his prized Rolex wristwatch, an item that seemed like the first thing to be taken if this was a robbery gone wrong. Yet, it remained untouched. Alongside these items was an open pack of cigarettes, identified as belonging to Belinda. Strangely, the family's bathing suits were missing from inside their truck, hinting that they had planned a return trip, possibly to the water, before their sudden disappearance. Belinda's mother spent some time calling out for the family and checked the nearby river, hoping to find some clue to their whereabouts. But there was no sign of them anywhere. All their personal belongings were left behind in such a way that it didn't make sense for them to have just gone off for a short walk or a quick errand. If they had, they would have taken their essentials, like the purse and keys. The more she thought about it, the stranger it all seemed. If they had gone for a quick hike or drive, they certainly wouldn't have left their stuff behind, open and exposed, where anyone could come across it. By now, the unsettling feeling had settled in. No signs of an accident, no tracks, no evidence of a struggle, just an eerie emptiness. Belinda's mother returned home and immediately contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Soon after, the troopers arrived at the campsite only to find it just as Belinda's mother had left it, everything in place, but no sign of the family. There was no blood, no violence, and nothing out of the ordinary. The situation was described as creepy and unnerving. No one knew what to think. Naturally, the rumors began. Some speculated that maybe Bigfoot had made its presence known, claiming yet another victim. After all, the mystery surrounding the disappearance, combined with the eerie setting, left room for all sorts of strange theories. The next morning, a full-scale search began for the Cowden family, triggering one of the largest search operations in Oregon's history. But prior to this, the Cowden family's pet basset hound, Droopy, showed up alone, scratching at the door of the Copper General Store. The dog's return, without its family, made it clear that something had gone terribly wrong, and this case would be discussed by media outlets nationwide, including the New York Post, and become one of the most perplexing and haunting chapters in the state's history. The search involved helicopters with infrared technology, search dogs, and teams scouring caves, woods, and waterways, all while locals, hunters, and volunteers combed the surrounding areas. Despite the intensity of the search, nothing was found. It seemed as if the Cowden family had simply vanished without a trace. The police didn't stop at physical searches. They interviewed over 150 people in hopes of uncovering any clue about the family's whereabouts. But still, nothing came up. The community also refused to give up, though. A reward of $2,000, about $12,602 today, was offered for any information that could solve the mystery. Richard Cowden's sister even took to the Medford Mail Tribune, writing a heartfelt plea for hunters to stay vigilant. She hoped that even the smallest clue could help solve the mystery of the family's disappearance. The push for answers didn't stop there. Over 200 people wrote to Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, urging him to get the FBI involved. Unfortunately, their request was denied. The reasoning: there was no evidence to suggest that the family had been kidnapped or taken across state lines. As time passed, investigators wondered if there could be a connection between the Cowden family's disappearance and other unsolved cases in the area. 8 women had gone missing around the same time, under similarly mysterious circumstances. The investigation took a chilling turn when it was revealed that these 8 disappearances were attributed to the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. What did this discovery mean for the Cowden case? Did it shift the investigation in a new direction, or was it just another layer of complexity added to an already puzzling mystery? As autumn turned to winter, then spring, the mystery deepened. The families and community members who had been searching were left with more questions than answers. It wasn't until April 12, 1975, more than 7 months after the Cowden family vanished, those 2 young gold prospectors, working near Sturgis Fork about 7 miles east of Carberry Creek, made a discovery that would provide a chilling conclusion to the Cowden family's disappearance. While searching the forest floor, they first spotted scattered bones, but as they looked up, they saw something far more chilling: a skeleton tied to a tree. Surrounding it, more bones were scattered across the forest floor, suggesting this had been a grisly crime scene for some time. Terrified by what they had found, the men quickly fled and contacted the police. Authorities arrived swiftly, securing the area and beginning their investigation. They soon confirmed that the skeleton was indeed Richard Cowden, identified through dental records. The location was now a crime scene, one that seemed more like something out of a horror movie. The police continued their search, determined to find the rest of the Cowden family. Not far from the tree where Richard's body had been found, they discovered a cave hidden behind a pile of smaller rocks. After carefully moving the rocks aside, they entered the cave and made an even more disturbing find: the bodies of Belinda, David, and baby Melissa. The Cowdens had been found, but the reality of what had happened to them was even worse than anyone had imagined. Examinations of the remains revealed the horrifying truth. Belinda and her young son, David, had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. Little Melissa, only a baby, had suffered fatal head injuries, likely from blunt force trauma. Richard's body, tied to the tree, showed no signs of bullet wounds or firearm-related injuries. Instead, his cause of death was believed to be either stabbing or strangulation. However, it remained unclear whether he had died before or after his wife and children. One theory briefly emerged, that Richard had killed his family and then taken his own life. But this idea was quickly dismissed. How could he have done that if he was found tied to a tree? Additionally, the murder weapon, a rifle, was never recovered, further suggesting that someone else was responsible for the brutal killings. Whoever committed this gruesome act was likely familiar with the area, possibly even someone with intimate knowledge of the wilderness. What made this discovery even more disturbing was the fact that the very area where the bodies were found had already been searched back in September, just a week after the Cowdens disappeared. There was no one in the area at the time when the search happened. The man who had previously searched that same spot confirmed it. He could even point out the exact cave he had checked, stating that the Cowden family wasn't there when he looked. So what did this mean? It suggested that the Cowden family, all 4 of them, had been held hostage somewhere else for about a week before being brought to that spot, possibly after the initial search had died down. It seemed they were still alive when they were brought there, only to be killed. The discovery of shell casings at the scene pointed to the fact that they were likely killed right at that spot. The police were desperate to talk to anyone who had been in the area around the time the Cowdens were believed to have been abducted. Some campers had seen Droopy, the family's dog, wandering a couple of miles from the campsite, but they thought nothing of it at the time. The dog eventually made its way to the Copper General Store. Meanwhile, an elderly family from Los Angeles had arrived to camp at Carberry Creek on Sunday, September 1st, after the Cowdens were abducted. They reported seeing 3 people, a man, a woman, and another man, in a pickup truck near the campsite. The family found them unsettling, feeling like they were waiting for someone to leave before they packed up. Could this have been Richard, Belinda, and the killer? Was the killer holding them at gunpoint in the truck? At this point, the mystery of the Cowden family's disappearance had everyone baffled. The family had no known enemies and were actually well liked by their community. Yet, there was one person who stood out as a potential suspect, Dwayne Lee Little. Investigators still believe he may have been involved, and his chilling background has kept this suspicion alive over the years. In 1974, Dwayne was just 25 years old and lived in the small town of Rush, near the dense forests of Oregon. What made his story even more disturbing was the fact that he had been released from the Oregon State Penitentiary only 4 months before the Cowdens vanished. Dwayne had spent years in prison for the brutal assault and murder of a teenage girl, Orla Faye Phipps. At first glance, Dwayne appeared to be a model citizen, charming, good-looking, and even serving as class president. But his dark side was revealed when Orla, a neighbor, went for a horseback ride one day and never returned. After a search, her body was found, and the world learned of the terrible crime he had committed. But what was truly chilling was that no one really knew why he did it. Orla had been an innocent teenager, and Little's motives for such a horrific act remain a mystery to this day. He served a 10-year sentence before being granted parole. According to his mother, he suffered serious head trauma as a child, a common factor among many notorious criminals. On top of that, it's believed his mother's behavior towards him was psychologically damaging, not through physical abuse, but by manipulating his emotions and actions. This troubling home life may have shaped his violent tendencies in the years to come. After serving time for the brutal crime he committed against Orla, Dwayne was released in May of 1974. He moved to Medford, Oregon, where he worked in a warehouse and lived with his parents. Strangely, his parents' house was just a short distance from the Cowden family's campsite near Carberry Creek. During Labor Day weekend that year, Dwayne was reportedly in Copper, but when questioned by the police, he denied ever meeting the Cowdens or having any knowledge of their disappearance. But there was more to his story. His girlfriend at the time, who came forward after Dwayne cheated on her, told police that he owned a .22 caliber rifle. This raised some serious questions because convicted felons like Dwayne were not allowed to possess firearms. What made this even worse was that 2 of the Cowden family members had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle. The most puzzling part, though, was Dwayne's refusal to take a polygraph test when questioned about the Cowden murders. The officers told him that if he passed the test, he wouldn't be sent back to prison for illegally possessing a firearm. Yet, Dwayne still refused. This only fueled suspicion and led to him being sent back to prison for violating his parole. He would be released again in 1977. In 1980, Dwayne's violent nature resurfaced in a chilling way. A pregnant woman named Margie Hunter was his next victim. Her car had broken down near Portland, Oregon, and Dwayne, pretending to be a good Samaritan, offered her a ride, but instead of helping, he attacked her, strangling, stabbing, and assaulting her. Miraculously, Margie survived the brutal assault and was able to identify Dwayne as her attacker. It was later revealed that they had worked together, which made her identification of him even more certain. Dwayne was convicted for this crime and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Now, if you're still not convinced that Dwayne Little might be the killer of the Cowden family, here's something that could make you rethink. remember the testimony from the elderly couple who reported seeing a truck with a man and a woman in the front and another man in the back. They said the woman appeared to be crying, which gave them a creepy feeling. Well, it was later confirmed that the truck matched the description provided by the couple, and it was actually Little's family's truck. To make things even more unsettling, while Dwayne and his parents denied any involvement or knowledge of the Cowdens' disappearance, a miner who owned a nearby cabin revealed that Little and his parents had stopped by on Monday, September 2nd, 1974, and even signed a guest book he kept for visitors. This was just a few days after the Cowdens went missing. Even more damning, while serving time for a different crime, an inmate named Rusty Kelly, who once shared a cell with Dwayne Little, claimed that Little confessed to him that he was responsible for the Cowden family murders. Despite this, and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Little has never been formally charged in connection with the murders. It's a haunting mystery, with so many pieces that seem to point in his direction, but no clear resolution. And to this day, the remaining family of the Cowden family still holds out hope that someday justice will be served. Dwayne is now 75 years old and serving his sentence at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Given his age and the length of his confinement, it makes you wonder, will justice ever be truly delivered? So, I've got to ask you, what do you think? Do you believe Dwayne could have been responsible for the Cowden murders? And if he did, do you think he could have pulled it off all by himself? I mean, come on. He managed to tie Richard to a tree while Belinda and the kids were still held captive in the cave. I want to hear your thoughts. Comment down below and let's get this conversation going.
I cannot believe this.
What do you mean? You can't believe what?
You are going to try to blame me for killing my children and my daughter.
Over the years, we've all heard the shocking stories of cheaters who somehow end up becoming family annihilators. And today's case, well, it's one for the books. This one took a staggering 13 years to unravel, and the crazy part is, it flipped everything we thought we knew about cheaters and killers on its head. David Camm, a man once suspected of killing his entire family, is at the center of this mind-bending story. But was he really the killer, or did someone else pull the strings? And if it wasn't him, who was capable of such a horrific act? Trust me, this is one of the most twisted and mind-boggling mysteries you'll ever hear. And just like always, we're going to break down every detail of this case, piece by piece.
Jury selection is now underway in one of the most controversial local murder cases in recent history. David Camm.
This is David and Kimberly Camm. The two grew up in the same city, New Albany, Indiana, and crossed paths back in the mid-1980s. They hit it off, and by 1989, Kim had become David's second wife. Things seemed to be heading in the right direction. That same year, David applied to join the Indiana State Police, and before long, he was accepted, eventually working as a police officer in the Emergency Response Unit. Fast forward a few years to 1993, and the couple welcomed their first child together, a boy named Bradley. It was Kim's first baby, but David's second, as he already had a daughter from his previous marriage. Life seemed to be good for the growing Camm family. But things began to unravel in the summer of 1994, when David started an affair with a younger woman named Stephanie McCarty, someone he met at the gym. This betrayal couldn't have come at a worse time for Kim. She was pregnant with their second child. The situation escalated quickly. David moved out of their home and into his mistress's, leaving Kim to lean on her family for support. Despite everything, both her family and David's stayed by her side, offering the help she needed during such a challenging time. When Kim gave birth to their daughter, Jillian, on February 28, 1995, both sides of the family showed up for support. Everyone, that is, except David. By March of that year, however, the affair ended, and David sought reconciliation. Despite the heartbreak, Kim considered giving him another chance, driven by her love for her family and her role as a mother. Surprisingly, David moved back in, and Kim's decision to forgive him was met with support from both families. Soon after, they began building a new home on Lockhart Road in Georgetown, Indiana, a fresh start for the reunited couple. They chose to live in this location because of its personal connection. The road was actually named after some of David's relatives on his mother's side, adding a layer of history and significance to their home. For a while, things seemed to improve, and it looked like they were on the right track. But as the saying goes, once a cheater, always a cheater. David, known for being a flirt, didn't just stop at flirting. He would find women to have casual affairs with, often using his patrol car as his hookup spot. On top of that, David was involved in a lawsuit with 2 other state troopers, accused of assaulting a 19-year-old during an arrest. To add to his already shaky record, there were numerous other complaints filed against him. His ego took a hit when he got demoted yet again, which only fueled his narcissistic tendencies. Fed up with the lack of respect, David made a bold move. He handed in his resignation and joined his uncle's basement waterproofing business, landing a sales position. Suddenly, the perks were clear. His new job gave him better hours, meaning he was actually around more often for Kim and the kids, something he hadn't been able to do as a state trooper. Now, he wasn't just a stranger in his own home. He was there, involved. Plus, he was making way more money than he ever did as a cop, which added a touch of luxury to their lives. By the year 2000, everything seemed to be falling into place for the family. Bradley, now 7 years old, was doing great in 2nd grade at Graceland Christian School, while his little sister Jill, just 5, was in kindergarten at the same school. Kim was thriving in her job as a senior accountant at Insurance Group in Louisville. From the outside, life seemed perfect now. But even in this seemingly happy home, there were still whispers about David's possible cheating. The rumors had been floating around, and Kim had even shared her worries with her best friend. But despite all the gossip, nothing ever came of it, until one fateful evening in September. On Thursday, September 28, 2000, David followed his usual routine, playing basketball with friends at the local church rec center. Kim, as always, took care of the kids' activities and got them home. It was just another regular evening. However, the game ran later than David had expected. By the time he was done, he was in a hurry to get home, worried Kim might be upset. Their house was just a few minutes away, so he grabbed his garage door remote and pulled into the driveway. But as the garage door slowly opened, what David saw inside stopped him dead in his tracks. In the garage, his wife Kim was lying on the floor with what appeared to be a gunshot wound to her head. A pool of blood spread across the floor beneath her. The passenger door of her black Ford Bronco was open, but David couldn't immediately tell if his kids were in the car. He rushed to the Bronco and looked inside. In the back seat, his worst fears came true. His children, Jill and Bradley, were in the same horrifying condition as Kim. David's law enforcement instincts took over. He quickly assessed the situation and realized Kim and Jill were beyond saving. David Camm believed his son might still be alive since the boy showed no signs of head injuries. Acting on hope, he climbed into the passenger side of the Bronco, maneuvered through the 2 front bucket seats, and carefully lifted his son out. And when he touched Bradley, he felt a faint warmth in his small body. He placed the boy on the garage floor and began administering CPR. During this process, David's left knee pressed into the middle of the back seat, which caused Jill's head and body to slump forward and to the left. This motion brought her into contact with David's t-shirt, leaving traces of blood on it. Now, this moment became one of the most critical points in the case. Whether David was guilty or not, his actions now intertwined his DNA with the crime scene. And when his efforts failed, reality hit him like a truck. David knew he needed to act quickly. In a panic, he called the Indiana State Police Department, his former workplace, for help.
Indiana State Police Radio, Patrice, can I help you?
Patrice, it's David Camm. Let me talk to Post Command right now.
Okay, he's on another line.
Right now, let me talk to Post Command.
Hold on. You're my only
signal 10. Okay, David, we got people on the way, okay? Get everybody out here. Come here. Everything's going to be okay, all right? We're going to get people... Everything's not okay. Get everybody out here now. They're coming. Go to Dave Camm's house now.
After the call, he sprinted across the street to his uncle's house, shouting for someone to tell him what had happened. He then dashed back to the garage, consumed with confusion and fear. When the police arrived at the scene, they found Kim exactly as David had described, her body lying on the floor with her pants removed, blood trailing from her head. Nearby, Bradley's lifeless body was found, while Jill's body was in the back seat of the car. It was immediately suspected that all 3 victims had been shot to death. Now, in the garage, there was a bucket that reeked of bleach. The detectives also found some unidentified fingerprints on the outside of Kim's car, but they didn't think much of it since she parked in a public lot every day for work, which could explain the prints. On the floor of the garage, tucked under Bradley's body, was a sweatshirt with the word backbone written inside the collar that no one seemed to recognize. When the police asked David about it, he claimed it wasn't his. As mentioned, Kim wasn't wearing any pants when she was found, only her underwear and shirt. However, her pants were nearby, covered in blood. And as with any murder case, the spouse is always the first one to be questioned, and David wasn't exempt from this. David was completely cooperative, providing a clear timeline of his day and explaining that Kim and the kids had probably come home around 7:30 or 7:40 p.m. Looking at the state of the car, David thought the murders must have happened almost immediately after they arrived home. Yet, he couldn't figure out who could have wanted to hurt his family. Kim and the kids weren't involved in anything that would have made them enemies, and when it came to his alibi, David stuck to his guns. He insisted that he was exactly where he said he'd be, at a basketball game at the rec center from 7 o'clock to 9:20 in the evening. David also kept insisting that Kim wouldn't have done anything to provoke this kind of violence. So, at first, the investigators wondered if it might have been a robbery gone wrong. But that idea didn't last long. There was no sign of forced entry into the garage, nothing seemed to be missing from the house, and no one had tried to get inside. The evidence was pointing away from theft and towards something much darker, a targeted attack on Kim, Bradley, and Jill. But the most damning evidence came later when the phone company revealed that David made a call at 7:19 p.m. on the night of the murders. The call was made from his home's landline, which was a huge red flag because David had claimed to be playing basketball from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. The fact that he made a call after 7 p.m. contradicted his story, and it raised serious doubts. The autopsy report added more to the mystery. All 3 victims had died from gunshot wounds, but the examiner also found that Jill had blunt force trauma to her genital area. This injury seemed to have occurred within the same 24-hour period as her death. The examiner suggested it might have been caused by a fall, but the possibility of an assault couldn't be ruled out. Strangely, Jill had complained of pain in that area during her dance class, even crying about it. Whether this had anything to do with the trauma to her body was uncertain, but it was a chilling detail. Kim had confided in a friend just before the murders, saying, "History is repeating itself." Kim didn't elaborate, but her friend suggested that she bring the kids down to Florida for a visit to talk more. Kim agreed that a trip might help, but tragically, she never got the chance. So, was Kim referring to a history of abuse? Perhaps something related to David's alleged infidelity, or possibly something darker. We may never know, as Kim was taken from her family before she could share the truth. The medical examiner's report also revealed something unsettling. Kim had cuts and bruises on the tops of her feet. Her shoes were oddly placed on top of the car, which just didn't make sense. The police had no clear explanation for any of this, and it was still early in the investigation. But people close to David, including Kim's mother, started to have serious doubts about him. Her mother believed that Jill, a sassy, outgoing child, would have spoken up if someone she wasn't familiar with had hurt her. The only person she thought might have been able to silence Jill was David, 3 days later, on Sunday, the rumors continued to swirl, especially since no arrest had been made yet. Despite the growing tension, David went to church with his parents and friends, just as he always did. His uncle, the pastor, led the service, and the church had strong connections to the family. Kim had served as the treasurer, and David's grandfather had even helped build the church. During the service, David cried the entire time, showing what seemed to be genuine emotion, but things took a dramatic turn as he left the church. A swarm of reporters surrounded him, and the media coverage quickly cast a shadow of suspicion over him. People couldn't help but notice that David didn't seem to be grieving in the way they expected. His cold, stoic demeanor raised more questions. Could David have been responsible for the brutal murders of his wife and children? And if so, why? Well, later that afternoon, David came into the station to speak with the police, and things got a bit heated.
I cannot believe this.
What do you mean? You can't believe what?
You are going to try to blame me for killing my children and my daughter.
Some of the blood or something like that.
No. This is ridiculous.
What about some bleach, Dave?
No.
After this interview, the police arrested him, and it all came down to two things: his shirt and a phone call. The call, made at 7:19 in the evening, didn't match his alibi of being at the rec center from 7 o'clock to 9:20 o'clock. That contradiction was enough to land him in custody. But the aftermath wasn't just about David. It was about his whole family. In the close-knit town of Georgetown, where everybody knows everybody, the Camm family became public enemy number one. Strangers gave them ugly stares. Their answering machine filled up with hateful messages. And if that wasn't enough, the local community started calling them a pack of wolves. The fallout even reached David's grandfather, whose church shut its doors because so many members wanted nothing to do with the Camm name. By March of 2002, it was trial time, and the prosecution came in hot, determined to answer the burning question: why would David do this? Their theory: his affairs. They argued David was so done with his marriage to Kim that instead of just filing for divorce, he chose the unthinkable of murdering his entire family. To sell this idea, the prosecution brought in about a dozen women who either had affairs with David or claimed he'd made a move on them while he was married to Kim. Over weeks of testimony, they painted David as a serial cheater with no respect for his marriage vows. Then came the evidence. The prosecution hung their case on two key pieces: blood spatter and that suspicious phone call. But the defense wasn't about to roll over. They argued the blood on David's shirt didn't come from gunfire. Instead, they said it got there when Jill's blood-soaked hair brushed against him while he was trying to save his son, Bradley. To prove it, they put on a live demonstration in court using wigs and fake blood, showing how the same pattern could easily happen. As for the phone call, the defense blamed Indiana's notoriously confusing time zones. They explained that the call's timestamp didn't account for a 1-hour difference between zones. When adjusted, the call actually fit David's timeline. It was made before he even left for his basketball game. And then there was David's alibi: basketball. Every single one of the 11 guys on his team testified that he was at the church gym the entire time. He never left, not even for a minute. With this rock-solid lineup, it seemed like the defense had poked some serious holes in the prosecution's case. But the jury didn't see it that way. They convicted David on 3 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy, and he was sentenced to 195 years in prison. At first, it seemed like everyone could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Justice had been served, right? Well, not so fast. David wasn't ready to go down quietly. He appealed, arguing that the evidence about his affairs should have never been allowed in court. And guess what? In 2004, the judge agreed, overturning his conviction. Just like that, the case was thrown back into chaos. David's second trial was scheduled for January 2006, but something game-changing happened in early 2005. The defense pushed for another look at the DNA from the sweatshirt found at the crime scene. Specifically, they wanted the unknown DNA profiles, 2 of them, run through CODIS, the National DNA Database. The prosecution had previously refused, but after a court order, they were forced to comply. The test results came back with a match for one of the DNA samples, and it turned out this particular sample had never been tested before, even though the prosecutor had assured everyone it had been analyzed and found no matches. The DNA was linked to Charles Boney, a convicted felon from nearby New Albany. Boney had been out on parole at the time of the crime after being convicted for a series of armed attacks on women, many of which involved stealing their shoes. One of his most recent crimes was an armed robbery and attempted abduction of 3 women at gunpoint. Now, Boney had a disturbing history. Some of his victims reported receiving harassing phone calls for months before the attacks, where he asked what they were wearing and if they wore high-heeled shoes. Boney had also admitted to having a foot fetish, a detail that seemed important to the defense, considering that Kim Camm's shoes had been removed and neatly placed on top of her car in a crime scene that was otherwise chaotic. Kim's feet also showed signs of bruises and abrasions, which seemed suspiciously linked to Boney's past behaviors. Boney was interviewed and took a polygraph test, but the results indicated that he was being deceptive. He denied involvement, claiming he had donated the sweatshirt to charity. However, just 2 weeks later, a palm print from Boney was found on Kim's vehicle, leading to his arrest. But what the police charged him with was conspiring with David to commit the murders. See, Charles ended up giving a 5-page written confession about how he knew David. He said that David seemed like a really sincere guy to him, and apparently they met at a pickup basketball game in New Albany. He also claimed their paths crossed again later at a meat shop, where David asked Charles to buy him an untraceable gun for $250. Charles agreed and delivered the gun, inadvertently leaving his palm print on David's Bronco. However, Charles's story began to change during further questioning. He now claimed that David was a bad guy, accusing him of abusing his daughter, Jill, in an intimate way, and cheating on his wife, Kim. According to Charles, David snapped when Kim discovered everything he was doing to their daughter, and that's when David wanted the whole family dead to cover his secrets. Charles said that before handing over the gun, he wrapped it in a gray sweatshirt to prevent oil leaks. He followed David to his house and waited in the driveway. Charles could hear a heated argument and then a gunshot. In a chilling moment, he described hearing Kim's son Bradley calling out, "Daddy, Daddy," before a gunshot rang out. Moments later, Charles claimed David came outside, aiming the gun at him as if to kill him too. Charles ran for cover in the garage where he moved Kim's shoes as if tidying up while fleeing for his life. After hearing a woman pull into the driveway, Charles fled the scene. In his confession, Charles claimed he only sold the gun to David and did not pull the trigger. He was reluctant to report the murders, fearing the authorities would pin the blame on him, especially as a black man. His statement eventually led to his arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, and he was sent back to jail awaiting trial. After his arrest, it was revealed that Charles had previously spoken to Stan Faith, one of the prosecutors in David's first trial. Charles admitted to knowing Stan well and had consulted with him before being considered a suspect. Stan later expressed regret over his involvement. Another clue emerged when police discovered DNA from Charles's ex-girlfriend, Mala, on the gray sweatshirt. At the time, they were dating, but their relationship ended shortly after the murders. Mala described how Charles had told her he was going to work that evening, but later came home around midnight with scraped knees. He then showed her a gun, something she had never seen before, and she was uncomfortable with it. The next morning, Charles was watching news coverage of the murders with his mother. After a fight, Mala left and did not see Charles for weeks. She later broke up with him, but her blood on the sweatshirt was explained by her being diabetic, and frequently pricking her finger for blood sugar tests. Charles's story began to unravel further. Despite claiming he fled the scene without retrieving the gun, his girlfriend's statement contradicted him, suggesting that Charles might have returned for the weapon. This fueled doubts about David's guilt. Still, both men were charged with the murders. While in jail, Charles wrote an autobiography, Blackbone, where he openly discussed selling the gun to David and his role in the murders. He also mentioned that David had promised him Kim's life insurance money in exchange for the gun. Charles's writings, along with his confessions and testimony from Mala, helped secure his conviction for conspiracy to commit murder. In 2005, Charles was sentenced to 225 years in prison as a habitual offender. And if you're asking, what about David? Well, his second trial kicked off on January 17, 2006, and things were about to get even more complicated. Remember, the reason he was granted a retrial in the first place was because the judge ruled that the prosecution had made a mistake by discussing David's many affairs. So, when this second trial began, the courtroom was officially barred from talking about his infidelity, which had initially been one of the prosecution's key arguments. Without that piece of the puzzle, the prosecutors needed a new angle, and they didn't hold back. They pivoted to a shocking accusation. David had been abusing his daughter, Jill, for a long period of time, and to cover up his actions, he murdered his entire family. The allegations were deeply disturbing and immediately made the case even more complex. But David's defense team didn't back down. They brought in a highly regarded medical examiner who stated that during Jill's autopsy there was no evidence of sexual trauma, specifically no damage to her hymen. Of course, this didn't rule out the possibility of other forms of abuse, as some methods wouldn't leave visible damage. But the defense team argued that there wasn't enough proof to suggest sexual assault, and they claimed that the prosecution was exaggerating the evidence to create a narrative that suited their theory of the crime. This expert also pointed out that while Jill did have blunt force injuries, some of which were in her pelvic region, those injuries weren't necessarily indicative of sexual abuse. According to the expert, these were simply injuries sustained during the brutal attack, and there was no concrete evidence to support the prosecution's claims. Now, this trial wasn't just about the allegations against David, it was also about the new evidence that had emerged. Thanks to some investigative work that had tracked down Charles, the police uncovered a wealth of new details, much of which came from Charles himself. They even learned from Charles's own testimony that David had purchased a gun with the intent to murder his family. The defense continued to argue, however, that the prosecution's case wasn't strong enough to convict David beyond a reasonable doubt. After weeks of testimony, on March 1, 2006, the jury convicted David for the murders of his wife Kim and their children, Jill and Brad. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But as soon as he was convicted, David appealed once again, and this time it was due to the abuse allegations involving his daughter. He maintained that there was no evidence to suggest he'd ever harmed Jill, and he argued that the accusations had influenced the jury's decision. And guess what? The Indiana Supreme Court sided with him. In a stunning move, they overturned the conviction, agreeing with David's claim that the prosecution's abuse allegations lacked proper evidence. The court stated that there was no competent evidence to support the sexual abuse accusations. Can you imagine what Kim's family was going through during all this? They had to relive their daughter and grandchildren's horrific deaths, only for it to happen over and over again in the courtroom. Kim's father, Frank, was absolutely devastated by the decision. I was kind of surprised by the overturn of the last verdict. All we want is the truth, and the truth is that David's guilty, he said, his voice full of frustration. Kim's family was determined to see David behind bars for life. They were sick of the back and forth and just wanted justice. Fast forward nearly 13 years later, and David's third trial began in August of 2013. This trial was unlike the previous ones. The prosecution decided to go in a new direction, focusing on the life insurance policy that David had taken out on Kim before her death. According to Charles, David wanted the money, and he wasn't planning to let anyone get in his way. Interestingly, Kim's life insurance policy had been increased shortly before her death, but she had signed off on the changes, meaning she knew about and approved them. Charles took the stand again during this trial, and his testimony was as bombshell as ever. He claimed that David had tricked him into being at the house when the murders happened. Charles also testified that David nearly shot him before he managed to escape. According to Charles, David was the one who did all the killing, and Charles never touched Kim, Jill, or Brad. But David's defense team was ready. They had even more DNA evidence this time around. They presented proof that Charles's DNA was found on Kim's underwear, as well as on Jill's and Kim's clothing. What's more, Charles's DNA was found under Kim's nails, indicating that she had fought back before she was killed. Despite all the DNA evidence and Charles's questionable involvement, the most solid evidence linking David to the crime scene was the blood spatter on his shirt. The prosecution argued that the blood belonged to the victims, but David's defense team insisted that this could easily be explained by the fact that David had tried to help Brad after he was shot in the head, brushing up against his hair and leaving blood on his shirt. After weeks of deliberation and intense courtroom drama, the jury returned their verdict on October 24, 2013. Not guilty on all charges. David was acquitted, and when the news was announced, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He broke down in tears, thanking his legal team and the jury for believing in him. It was a monumental moment after years of intense legal battles. However, not everyone was thrilled with the verdict. The community was divided. After all, 13 years of media coverage had left many wondering if David had truly been innocent. The evidence was strong, but some still felt there were unanswered questions. Despite the controversy, David decided to stay in the same town where it all happened. He got back to work at his uncle's business and started rebuilding his life. As if his trials hadn't been exhausting enough, David filed a civil lawsuit against several members of the prosecution team. You can't wreck someone's life, take away their freedom, their reputation, their identity, and you're not supposed to do that in this country, he said, making his anger clear. In the end, he received a settlement of over $5 million, part of which he used to repay those who supported him throughout his 13-year battle. Today, David is trying to move on. He's rebuilt his life from the ground up, but the pain of losing his family and reputation is still there. Since the acquittal, he's remained in contact with the jury members who helped secure his freedom. He was even hired by the Innocence Project as a case coordinator. The nonprofit works to exonerate wrongfully convicted individuals, and David seems to be a perfect fit for the organization given his own wrongful conviction experience. Meanwhile, Charles, the man at the center of all the controversy, still maintains his innocence. He's claimed to have found Jesus and is now a devout Christian. In recent interviews, he's given several versions of what happened that night, but his story hasn't wavered. He says that on the night of the murder, he took an untraceable weapon to the Camm residence. He claims he heard arguing, followed by shots, and that David was the one who pulled the trigger. It's tough to wrap your head around why Charles did what he did, especially with all the conflicting accounts. Many still believe that David had a role in the murders, but the evidence simply didn't add up to convict him. Some question whether Charles was motivated by greed, jealousy, or something deeper. Now, if you believe David is innocent, it's reassuring to know that he has found peace and freedom, rebuilding his life and career. But if you think he's guilty, it's hard not to wonder how he managed to escape justice. What do you think? Was David truly innocent, or did he get away with murder? And what about Charles? What drove him to take such extreme actions? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Imagine returning home, expecting your family to be safe and sound, only to find everything completely burned to the ground. For Kumar, This nightmare became his tragic reality. He came home to utter devastation. The house he'd built with his own hard work was now nothing but ashes. And even worse, his loved ones were gone, taken from him in the most brutal way imaginable. But the pain didn't stop there. Harish had a gut feeling about who was behind this unimaginable act. And now, it all comes down to us asking the same question. Why? Today we're diving deep into every chilling detail of this case, piecing together the clues to uncover the dark truth behind the motive. Because when someone murders an entire family, ties them up, beats them, and sets them on fire without any clear reason, well, you're dealing with a psychopath, plain and simple. To start with, Harish Kumar was the kind of guy who always put in the work. He wasn't one to sit around waiting for things to happen because, obviously, he made things happen. Back in the late 1970s, Harish decided to take a huge leap. He packed up his family and moved them to the United States, chasing the dream of a better life. His wife, Geeta Kumar, was no stranger to hard work either. If anything, she matched him step for step. They balanced each other out perfectly. Harish had the vision and drive, while Geeta had the steady, practical mindset that kept everything grounded. But of course, they didn't have it easy. Like any immigrant family, they faced their fair share of struggles, such as long hours, sacrifices, and tough decisions. But through it all, they refused to let anything stop them. Their relentless hard work started to pay off when, in the 1990s, they took another big step forward and bought a rundown hotel in the Studio City area. Ever since then, Harish and Geeta put their hearts into renovating the property, turning it into a shiny new hotel. They worked day and night, making sure every detail was perfect, and it didn't take long before they started seeing the rewards of their hard work. The Kumars soon expanded their success, developing a whole chain of hotels. Life seemed picture perfect for them. In fact, they had it all: a thriving business, a loving home, and two wonderful kids, Paris, their 18-year-old son, and Tulsi, their 16-year-old daughter. They were enjoying the fruits of their labor, feeling like they had finally reached the peak of what they'd worked so hard for. At that time, Harish's mother-in-law, Sitaban Patel, who was 63, also lived with them, and according to some, she was the backbone of the family, making sure the kids were well taken care of while Harish and Geeta focused on running the business. Sitaban was there to ensure everything ran smoothly at home, giving the couple the freedom to grow their business without worrying about their children. But here's the thing: if you're a business owner, you know you're never truly alone. There are always rivals, competitors ready to outdo you, challenge you, or even try to bring you down. And Harish and Geeta were no exception. This is where Victor Cowen enters the story. Just like Harish and Geeta, Victor was also a business owner, running a small, rundown hotel right next to the one the Kumar family had worked so hard to build. The two hotels were in the same area of Los Angeles, and believe it or not, their dispute started over something that seemed pretty minor: a back alley. Victor had blocked off the alley to expand his property, but Geeta needed that same alley to run her business properly. Naturally, tensions rose, and before long, the Department of City Planning got involved to try to sort things out. But according to Harish, it wasn't anything serious at first. It seemed like a simple problem about a back alley, something that could easily be resolved. He never expected it to lead to what was about to come next. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. On May 4th, 2002, that's when Harish Kumar decided to step outside of his home to take a breather. That evening, everything seemed like any other normal day. Harish had been working hard, as usual, and decided to take a break by going out to play volleyball with his friends. He walked out of the house with no worries, thinking that his family was safe and sound inside. His wife, Geeta, was home, along with his mother-in-law, Sitaban, and their two kids, Paras and Tulsi. By just after 11 p.m., Harish returned home from his game, ready to relax and get some rest. As he pulled into the driveway, he was struck by an unimaginable sight. His home, the place where he had built so many memories with his family, was on fire. Without a second thought, Harish rushed toward the front door, instinctively trying to get inside to rescue his loved ones. But the heat was unbearable. The thick smoke and intense flames blocked his every move. It was impossible to get through. His heart raced as panic set in, knowing that the people he loved most were inside, and there was nothing he could do to save them. So, Harish quickly pulled out his phone and dialed 911, desperately reporting the fire. And within moments, the fire department arrived at the single-family residence in Hollywood Hills, Los Angeles. But the heartbreaking truth was more than Harish could bear. After the flames were finally controlled and the smoke began to clear, detectives made a chilling discovery. This wasn't just a tragic accident. It had been set intentionally. As if the devastation of losing his home wasn't enough, Harish's world was turned upside down when authorities revealed the most horrifying detail of all. His family had been killed before the fire was even set. According to official reports, his family was found in one single room, and their bodies were burned beyond recognition. The charred remains were unmistakably those of his wife, Geeta, their son, Paras, their daughter, Tulsi, and Harish's mother-in-law, Sitaben Patel. The scene inside that room was one that would haunt anyone who laid eyes on it. According to investigators, all 4 victims had been hog-tied, their hands and feet bound tightly together with cords, and their mouths sealed with duct tape. This method of restraint was a glaring sign that something far more sinister had occurred. As Detective Pietrantoni noted, that is an obvious indication that foul play was involved. The victims had clearly suffered before their lives were taken. Jay Moberly, a former LAPD homicide detective, described the gruesome scene, saying they had obviously endured immense heat. He recalled how one of the bodies had a leg burned off up to the knee, further evidence of the severe, relentless heat that had consumed them. Initially, Harish was the first one to come under suspicion. After all, it seemed strange that he wasn't at home when his entire family was there, especially at night. The investigators wondered, how could he have not been around when all this happened? However, Harish quickly provided a solid alibi. He had been playing volleyball with his friends at the time, which was verified by others. He wasn't at the scene when the tragedy unfolded. But there was one thing Harish mentioned during his questioning that really stuck with the detectives. He brought up their ongoing dispute with Victor Govan, the same man we mentioned earlier, who had clashed with Geeta over a back alley. As the investigation progressed, new clues began to emerge. Surveillance footage from a nearby house showed that a gray truck had been spotted in the area before and after the fire had started. This piece of evidence raised a lot of questions. What was this truck doing near the scene of the crime? Even more concerning was the fact that when police looked closer, they realized the truck had no license plate. The police immediately began trying to track down the unmarked vehicle, hoping it would lead them to the culprit. But in the meantime, they continued to piece together evidence at the crime scene. As part of their investigation, detectives walked through the house with Harish, knowing he could provide any further insights. When they reached the room where his family had been found, Harish pointed out that some things were missing. Most notably, his wife's case of jewelry, which had contained valuable pieces, and around $5,000 in cash were gone. But despite the missing valuables, investigators were quick to dismiss the idea that this was a simple robbery gone wrong. The crime scene told a much darker story, one filled with hatred and malice. As the investigation deepened, the autopsies revealed even more disturbing details that sent chills down everyone's spine. The victims had been burned alive, something that was confirmed by the smoke found in their lungs. But the horror didn't stop there. Geeta and Tulsi, the mother and daughter, both had injuries to their throats. And just when it seemed like the case couldn't get any more twisted, a new lead came to light. Rod Burnson, a former LAPD sergeant and crime reporter for Fox 11, reached out to detectives with some shocking information. He had received a call from an anonymous tipster who claimed to know who was behind the gruesome quadruple murder and the arson. Bernson managed to convince the tipster, named Angelberto Novoa, to meet with investigators and provide more details. Angel revealed that, 6 weeks before the murders, he had been approached by someone to intimidate a few people into signing some contracts. Angel didn't know all the details, but he knew that he would be working with two men, one named Pedro, who drove a gray truck, and another named Freddy. As the investigators listened carefully, they learned that the targets of this scheme had been the Kumars, but things didn't go as planned, and whatever arrangement or deal they had with the Kumars fell apart. The plot thickened when Angel identified one of the men, Freddy, as Victor Govan, the very business rival Harish had mentioned earlier. But the twists kept coming. Detective work led them to another man named Carlos Amador, who had a gray pickup truck registered in his name. The investigators dug into Amador's history and uncovered some unsettling details. He had a record of minor offenses, but what really stood out was that some of those offenses had been committed alongside none other than Peter Govan, Victor's brother. This was the link that investigators needed to connect the dots. Victor Govan, his brother, and their associates were now the primary suspects in what seemed like a carefully orchestrated act of vengeance. Now Peter Govan's criminal record added another layer of intrigue to the investigation. 7 years earlier, he had been convicted for assault with a firearm, yet somehow he had received less than 2 years in jail for the crime. The leniency of his sentence didn't sit well with investigators, who now saw Peter's violent tendencies as part of a bigger pattern. But it was the Govans' business ambitions that truly caught their attention. The Govans had massive expansion plans tied to the disputed alleyway. If they won the rights to it, it would have meant millions of dollars for their business. According to Moberly, this alley was more than just a small plot of land. It was a key to the future of the Govans' empire. And it seemed like the Kumars were standing in their way. But what really fueled the anger between the two families wasn't just about business. It was about who was in charge. Investigators discovered that the Govans were enraged by the fact that Harish Kumar had deferred to his wife, Geeta, during their discussions about the alley. We determined that both Victor and his brother were incensed by the fact that they had to talk to Geeta, said Pietrantoni. This simple act of respect, of allowing Geeta to handle negotiations, seemed to have sparked the bitter hatred between the families. The timing of the dispute was also crucial. A hearing was scheduled for May 10th, just 6 days after the murders, to decide the fate of the alleyway. Would the Kumars or the Govans win? According to Fatal Family Feuds, the outcome would have been pivotal. Investigators spoke with city planners who confirmed that Geeta would likely have been granted full access to the alley, and Victor Govan would have been forced to remove any illegal structures he had set up there. This potential loss, combined with the growing animosity, could have been the final straw for the Govans. In their pursuit of justice, investigators turned to a more covert approach. They tapped the phones of Victor and Peter Govan, as well as their associate Amador. Pretending to be auto theft detectives, they managed to speak with Amador and get the VIN number of his truck, the same truck that had been seen in the area around the time of the fire. Around this time, another tipster came forward with crucial information. The witness revealed that Amador had confessed to them about a meeting with two of his Indian friends at a house, claiming they had gone there to get some documents signed. But according to Amador, things got out of hand. The tipster said that Amador mentioned seeing someone's face, and then, in a chilling turn of events, one of the Govan brothers had ordered that everyone in the house be killed, and the house set on fire to cover up the crime. This bombshell revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation, but the breakthroughs didn't stop there. The police tracked down a third witness, another individual who admitted that he'd been asked by Amador to act as an alibi. It seemed that Amador was deeply entangled in the Govans' plot, and now had no choice but to cooperate with the authorities. Eventually, Amador was apprehended by the LAPD. After being interrogated, he agreed to testify against the Gowen brothers, painting a terrifying picture of the events leading up to the brutal murders. According to Amador, he had been there when the Kumar family was ambushed. He described how the victims were tied up, beaten, and brutally threatened before Victor Gowen, who Amador referred to as Virendra, ordered that they be killed. The killers then doused the entire house with flammable liquid, setting it ablaze to ensure that no evidence would remain. By late July, investigators had reason to believe that the Gowens, aware that Amador had been in contact with the authorities, might be planning to kill their co-conspirator. This added an even darker layer to the case. Not only had they orchestrated the brutal murder of the Kumar family, but they might also be willing to eliminate anyone who could potentially turn on them. After 4 intense weeks of deliberations, the jury finally reached a verdict for Victor Gowen, but they couldn't agree on his brother, Peter. The jury foreperson shared that 9 jurors were ready to acquit Peter, while 3 jurors believed he should be convicted. With this split, Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell declared a mistrial in Peter's case, meaning they would have to start over with a new trial for him. As the court read the verdict for Victor, he remained eerily calm. His eyes stayed downcast, showing no emotion. It was like he wasn't fazed by the gravity of what was happening. Meanwhile, Harish, who had lost his entire family in such a brutal way, was utterly devastated. He was heartbroken beyond words, but still found the strength to speak out about how he never could have imagined Victor could do something so cruel. His voice shook as he said, "Victor was my neighbor, and we were really close. I never thought he would have such a vicious mind to do such a thing." During the same court session, Amador stepped forward and shared what he had seen that night. He told the court in detail how he watched Victor Gowen strangle the Kumar family members while Peter Gowen joined in the violent attack. But not everyone was buying into Amador's story. The defense team worked hard to undermine his credibility, calling him a liar and even suggesting that he might have been the one who masterminded the whole thing. Victor Gowen's lawyer, Richard Steingard, tried to argue that there was no real business dispute between the families and insisted there was no concrete evidence connecting Victor to the crime beyond Amador's testimony. Meanwhile, Peter Gowen's attorney, John E. Sweeney, focused on the lack of solid evidence to convict Peter, other than what Amador had said. Sweeney went as far as calling Amador a disgusting, pathetic psychopath, trying to paint him as untrustworthy. But then again, that's what defense attorneys are there for, to stand by the suspect. After 2 years of courtroom drama, Victor Gowen was convicted and sentenced to death just before Christmas in 2004. Amador, on the other hand, pleaded guilty to 4 counts of second-degree murder back in 2003, receiving a life sentence. Fast forward on April 4, 2005, and the jury found Peter Gowen guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder, confirming that he'd committed the crimes for financial gain during a robbery and burglary and in a brutal multiple murder spree. Just like his brother, Peter was sentenced to death. Tragically, Harish Kumar passed away just a few months after the trial wrapped up. Some say he may have followed his family in spirit, finally at peace, knowing those responsible were brought to justice. But again, we're not done yet. While on death row, Victor Gowen, 51, was found in his cell at 10:15 p.m. in 2018 and was pronounced dead at 10:30 p.m. His death occurred 2 days after Orange County serial killer Andrew Urdiales, 54, was also found dead in his cell. It's a chilling pattern that more death row inmates seem to die by their own hands than by execution. So, if you're curious about the case of Andrew Urdiales, let us know in the comments, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on the Kumar massacre too. Do you think Amador deserved a life sentence instead of the death penalty? And do you think the brothers are truly psychopaths for such a simple reason? Share your thoughts below. If you like the way we create these videos and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.